Hello and welcome to Undrafted, a Dynasty Game Theory podcast brought to you by OTC Fantasy. I am your host, Scott Belanger, a.k.a. Jax Falcone. You can find me on Twitter at Dino Game Theory. This is episode number 243. Let's roll. And we are inching ever closer to the actual NFL draft. But until then, we must talk about the proverbial NFL draft and the prospects as if we know what the hell we're talking about. Well, I've got someone who actually does know what they're talking about. The great Matt Waldman joins me today. Matt's been making the rounds, but he's been making the rounds on this show for years, dating back to 2022. We've had Matt on every single year, and I'm so grateful to bring him back yet again. Basically, it's just one long conversation with me and Matt. It's just taken over 5 years for us to get to this particular place. Matt Waldman, I am so grateful that you choose to come on this show. Welcome to the program, Mr. Waldman.
Hey, Scott, it's a pleasure. And I always look forward to these conversations that we had. We've been having a lot of fun for a number of years now. So we should, I don't think we should expect any less, as we move forward today.
Well, your rookie scouting portfolio has been something that's been, a time-honored tradition. People certainly look to it. I know certainly people like to poke holes in it. I see that with JJ Zacharyson all the time too. He's always defending himself. I'm always like, don't worry, there's trolls everywhere. But I think that, that's actually a good thing. If there's people trying to say what you got wrong, well, that means they're paying attention, and that means that you have some merit there. So I think that's always fun to watch. People come at me all the time, and I'm always, I'm grateful for it. I look at it as a badge of honor. If someone's coming at me saying I'm an idiot, that must mean that there's something there. So I find it fun and try and be better next time is, I guess, the best way I look at it too.
The way I look at it, well, everyone's going to miss, everybody's got a different process that happens. And also, I often tell people that the first step in becoming a lifetime subscriber to the RSP is to think I'm an idiot.
Yes.
That I've often seen that is like, oh, you're an idiot about, and then you don't know football about this. And then next thing you know, they're following. Next thing you know, they decide to subscribe. They wish they had done it 2 or 3 years ago. And, and then they, they're diehard fans. And not everybody's going to be that way. There's going to be people who see something and they just never forget it because they had something personal attached to it. Maybe their ego got chopped down a bit because they drafted somebody that I liked that didn't work out, and they paid a big price, and then somebody laughed at them and their feelings got hurt, and they felt like that was it. Like that one thing was like the thing that tipped it over for them as opposed to anything else. But when you make mistakes, you think of players. I laugh because the player I hear most often about is Hakeem Butler.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, it's kind of funny because I think that was 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And what you learn from certain things, what I ended up doing is, I updated how I look at wide receivers to the point that I would probably challenge anybody to have a better track record with wide receivers than I have had since that time.
Yeah.
I've had a strong point of that. And part of that is just adapting to a wide receiver coach's process who works with professional wide receivers and kind of changing some things that I needed to get more granular with, and then being able to apply that. And I'd say that what's funny is I would say now wide receiver is probably the strongest position that I do. And the position now I'm going back to probably update now as I look at it will be running back moving forward. Which used to be the one that everybody said, oh, clearly he's a running back guy. That was what it used to be. And so it's funny how that works.
I was going to maybe get to this further down the line, but I also think it's important to mention right now because I was going to say, I have to mention that there is a difference between scouting for different purposes, right? So I often say there's many in the environment. Cody Carpentier is one in the fantasy space who I think is more of a NFL-based scouter. I think you are more of an NFL-based scouter. I think maybe the film guys to some degree are a little bit more NFL-based scouters. than the analytics guys who are trying to solve for a different equation. I always say there's what are you trying to solve for? Are you trying to solve for NFL efficacy? Well, deep threats are very effective in the NFL. They change the game. Having an effective deep threat in the game in the NFL level changes the geometry of the field, changes how defenses have to play, changes how deep safeties will play, changes everything, but it doesn't necessarily score fantasy points that often because they don't get targeted that much. Whereas I can see that and I can dunk on that player and be like, he's a deep threat merchant, and say don't draft him fantasy people, right, in your fantasy draft. But also at the same time, if we're running an NFL team, I'd be like, actually very good on the deep ball, can really get down the field, knows how to, we could talk about all that and both be correct that he's a great player for the NFL, but not good for your fantasy team. And I think that's where, some people fail to understand the purpose of the analysis. And then I take it a step further. I take what you say and then I add it to what I may know or what I'm trying to solve for and go from there.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I'd probably say that I'm more of a mix between the two. It's
Sure.
just that the rookie scouting portfolio pre-draft is more football. It's
Right.
definitely more football. It's like I don't care about draft capital. I don't care about character. I'm just looking at particular skill sets
Yes.
and then aligning them for a wide range of protect teams that could possibly be interested in that player.
Right.
So there may be players like you said, you gave that example, be something else. But then in my post draft, which I think most people we don't I don't do as much of the podcast post draft
Sure.
wise,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
my post draft stuff, I
Yes.
look at draft capital, I look at fit, and so somebody. But what I often do is when I refer back to a player, whether I felt like I hit or missed or learned something from it, I usually look back at the pre draft because I feel like that has more of an evergreen value and more value to apply to different situations. But when I use the post draft, yeah, what I'll do is I'll look at somebody and go, say like Makai Lemon and Carnell Tate, just as a good example for right now. Carnell Tate's my number one, and it's not even close. And then, Makai Lemon's my number two. And while both of them are guys that have strong grades who could start right away, if Makai Lemon lands on a team that has a strong quarterback, has a good set of, either a strong running back who can catch out of the backfield and maybe a deep threat receiver as well, and, decent surrounding talent, I might look at him and say, you know what? He's going to get to be the Amon-Ra St. Brown expression of what he does. I might rate him over Carnell Tate if he's playing for the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah.
If that's what happens. In contrast, if it looks like he's going to a team that's going to play a lot of 12 personnel, I don't like the tight ends particularly to be great matchup threats if they put him outside, and he's going to have to play more flanker. I'm going to be like, well, yeah, I mean that's great that he can be flanker and a slot, but
Sure.
I'd rather him be in the slot. I'm going to stay with Tate. Those
Yeah.
types of things happen. So
Yeah,
yeah,
no, absolutely. And we're gonna get there because I think that's definitely a spot where I'm gonna, we're gonna have a good conversation there. But
sure.
I think it's important to understand the difference because there is a difference. Because if you just said, listen, Scott, this is your job. You need to tell NFL teams which players are good and which players can do certain things for their NFL team. I'd be like, oh, okay. Well, then a lot of the analysis that I do would be rendered useless to some degree. I mean, ironically, for some reason, much of the analysis that I and others like me have done have seemed to be more predictive of NFL success than than maybe some people might give us credit for. But so maybe I shouldn't ignore it. I guess if I were, I'd be like, well, look at these nerdy ass stats, Mr. GM, and they'd be like, I get this guy out of here. But they've been pretty predictive, and we've been able to sort of identify this. But we really can't do that without draft capital. And I would say that draft capital is what people think of the players outside of just the numbers, right? You know what I mean? So we also admit that draft capital is a big part of our analysis, the data that we use. Well, I would say that draft capital is kind of the film part. If you don't, does that make sense
I
a
th
little bit?
I would say draft capital I would say draft capital is independent of both analytics and film.
Right. Yeah.
Um, draft I just to make sure I remember correctly, I can curse on this show, right?
Please.
Draft capital is some bullshit in some when it comes to
Yeah.
it's predictive of talent. It's
Right.
not talent, but it's closely aligned in the pattern in a way that like you could say that that one snake that's poisonous is has the same markings as a snake that isn't.
Yeah.
It's because draft capital is actually a predictor of the bias that
That's
decision
true.
makers have because what they're looking at is things that cover their assets when
That's
it
right.
comes to because they're
Yeah.
looking at prototypical size and dimensions. They're looking at the school they went to. They're looking at how many injuries they've had, what their off field is, what their stats are, things that they can go to the public from a PR perspective and say, we drafted this guy in our top 30 because we believe that based on the fact that he played on a national championship winning team. He won the Davy O'Brien Award. He won the Heisman Trophy Award. He's never had a major injury. He had X amount of years as a starter. He threw for this many yards and this many wins and did all these things. It
Yeah.
sounds like that if that guy fails, and you state all these bullet points, it sounds like you made a logical choice, but it just
Right.
didn't work out. But say you, this is why I got into this because say you on another end of the spectrum, say there's this running back in like the '90s who you or in the early 2000s that who you drafted who you know Gil Brandt said, hey, if this guy weighed about 10 pounds more and and was about an inch or two taller, he'd be a top 5 overall pick. So well, I'm thinking, well, why isn't he? Well, let's see. He was a top running back. Florida State, when they were a powerhouse, coveted him. He slipped on some black ice at night and tore his ACL in high school. They rescinded their scholarship. He wound up at a small school in the Northeast where he was a dual threat and a return specialist on top of that, was killing it, then played basketball, intramural basketball, and tore the other ACL. Returned and continued to kill it. He was a dual threat and went to the Senior Bowl and absolutely was, just showed what he was about at a higher level, even though, the practices there are there's problems with that too. But his film was great, and you see that, and he ends up getting drafted by Andy Reid, and he's Brian Westbrook.
Yeah.
Okay, Brian Westbrook could have easily been a first round pick based
Yeah.
on what we saw in hindsight. But because what are you going to do compared to what I compared in the bullet points? And you say,
Yeah.
yeah, I've got this running back who's shorter than the prototype, who weighs about 10 to 15 pounds less than the prototype. He's torn 2 ACLs and he played at a smaller program.
Yeah. No thanks.
Yeah, no thanks. We're not taking him in the if you take him in the first round and he doesn't hit, you look like an idiot and you're
Yeah.
immediately fired. If you,
Yes.
but if you take Alex Smith and he doesn't hit, um, you probably can buy time by adding more players and at least trying to supplement him and hope that it works out.
And on top of that, Matt, whenever you draft the first round player, if you drafted a first round wide receiver and a seventh round wide receiver, that seventh round wide on the same team, that seventh round wide receiver has to be way better, not just better, way better than the first round wide receiver to start taking reps over him in practice. It's just,
Yeah, it's the
it's the
hidden
sunk, yeah, it's a
my
sunk
buddy
cost corollary. Yeah,
Yeah, my buddy Ryan Riddle, who used to play for a number of teams as a pass rusher, wrote a great article at Bleacher Report way back in the day when Bleacher Report just started, and he was a part of that. He was a featured writer there. It was the hidden bias of being an NFL of an early round pick, and he would talk about his experiences in training camp after training camp, and you'd watch, and it's like the psychology is, you know, if if the Jaguars, for instance, drafted a player and he's an early round wide receiver, he can screw up multiple times, multiple reps, but he's getting the majority of the reps, and the GM and the coaches are going to go, that's okay. He'll get better. It's going to be okay. But if you get a running back who's like a UDFA and he makes one mistake out of 3 reps, they go, "See, I told you couldn't play." Then if he, like you said, if he starts playing well, the only reason they probably will give him a chance is players ahead of him got injured during camp, and now they need to see what they have in him,
Exactly.
or they're trying to get rid of Leonard Fournette, and they
Yeah.
go, Doug Marrone was like, "I like this James Robinson kid.
Yeah, this'll
He's pretty
work.
darn good.
Yeah.
Let me ask the GM if it's okay to have an open competition
Right.
at this position." He had
Yeah.
needed permission. So
Yeah.
when people say, "Oh, it's a meritocracy when you get to when once you get drafted, it's a meritocracy." No, it's
It's
not.
not.
You're
No.
competing with basically arm tied behind your back early on.
Yeah, we talk about this at, at running back position specifically, is that, hopefully you have enough draft capital to tether you to opportunity, because really at the running back position, I mean, I know you probably saw, I use the Woody Marks example. How many of the running backs that were drafted in last year's class, if they had been given the situation that Woody Marks was handed, where he just, oh, all of a sudden you're starting, bro. Like there was probably 10 or 20 of them, Dylan Sampson and DJ Giddens. And, I mean, just Taj Brooks, all of them, all the players that were behind other veterans who didn't get a chance to play, had they been given the Woody Marks, opportunity, probably would have been as good or better or whatever. Like, who knows? Maybe there's a great back that we didn't see, that would have been amazing in that role,
Well,
but we would have never
yeah.
known.
I mean, look at Rico Dowdle years later and
Bingo,
what he did,
bingo.
or
Yeah,
Michael Wilson years later when
yeah.
they got a quarterback who could actually
Throw
hang
it
in
to
the
the
pocket
outside.
and throw.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, throw it to the
so I
outside.
mean those are those types of things that that's why evaluation is a tricky thing because
Yes, sir.
you can those are two players I was very high on, but they took forever,
Yeah,
and you look at that and sometimes the information's correct, but the opportunity's not. And
yeah.
sometimes that's
And sometimes they put
hard
the
to
genie
describe.
back in the bottle, a James Robinson type or whatever. I remember, Matt, I famously was like, James Robinson is dead this upcoming year. And everybody's like, why would the Jaguars draft a running back? Why would they sign a run? They got James Robinson. I said, I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm saying it's gonna can happen. Be ready
Right,
for it. And sure enough, first round Travis Etienne. And I was like, there it is. And people are like, that's stupid. I'm like, it's not. It might be stupid. It's probably stupid. It's likely stupid, but it's the behavior of NFL GMs and front offices over and over again, is that they'll put the genie back in the bottle even after success, based off of past draft capital, which is pretty crazy. It takes a real special player to sort of fully overcome that. We see it all the time. People doubt these lesser prospects. And by the way, there's a couple of those prospects that I'm going to see if you agree with me on, that were a little lesser coming out than they are now, or at least that I think they are. And we're going to talk about that right after this. All right, welcome back to the program. I'm here with Mr. Matt Waldman. We are going to dive into the 2026 draft class. I'm going to ask a very simple and straightforward question, because I think every time I do a fantasy draft, a rookie draft, I always want to ask myself this one question, so I'll ask it to you. Of all the offensive position groups, obviously we're not talking corner and the rest of it, which, I'm sure as an NFL GM, I would ask this question of all position groups, but just of the four food groups, the wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, running back. Is there an elite talent, or multiple elite talents? And I'm talking tier one, high level, wherever you've put your highest level prospects before. Are there any of those in this draft? And if so, who?
I believe so. Carnell Tate is an elite talent to me. He's someone that can start right away and deliver production in an offense. I think that he's at that level. Is he at the level of, say, Malik Neighbors? No. But he's closer to Malik Neighbors than he is to, I mean, not in terms of how they play, but in terms of level of talent, he's closer to that than, say, last year we look at, you know, I liked Luther Burden a lot. I would say he's in that tier of Luther Burden and where people looked at maybe Travis Hunter and thought what he would be able to offer. He's in that range. I would say at um, running back, it's very close. I would say that Jeremiah Love, he's on the cusp of being an elite talent. Um, and I think that he's close on that front. Um, those are the two. I would say, I would say that while with at quarterback, I have not I don't in a long time I have not studied an elite talent coming out at quarterback, but I would say that most quarterbacks are players who really need a lot around them to
Yeah,
thrive early. Um, and most of them, when they don't have a lot around them, struggle significantly, and it may even impact their future because of that. Fernando Mendoza to me is more on the level of Caleb Williams, which is a player who, if you put him in a really bad situation and you know what you're looking at, you're going to see a player who is going to get better and continue to perform well. And they're more as I've talked about before, they're more of a thermostat than a thermometer. They will get better and they won't get ruined by the team around them. And I think that Mendoza is that guy at quarterback.
yeah.
So those are my three that
You
I
know,
would mention.
the quarterback, if you notice, I didn't put a ton of notes for us to talk about quarterbacks just because I think it's so difficult. It's such a difficult position to scout because you can scout physically. We can see that. We can say, oh, look at this throw to the outside. Look at this accuracy on this particular decision. Look at the way that he put some air under this ball to let his running back clear on the wheel route or whatever. You can actually identify those types of things. But what you can identify is look at this. This was what they were preparing for. They knew it was going to be cover two based off this, this guy cheating down every single time they do that. He knows that. That's why he checked this and did that. We don't know that.
I
We can't, we have a
Yeah.
hard time knowing what they talked to. We don't know. We don't know that. And I hear Tom Brady, as bad as he is at announcing, he's so great at talking when he's not announcing. And he was just talking about how that was his superpower, how he was prepared so much more than every other player, and how he knew the answers to the test. And yeah, he knew he was going to make the play because he had already seen them play that defense 4,000 times during the week of practice that led up to the game. And
Mhm.
will this quarterback, whomever it is he going to do that? We don't know. We
I
don't know.
Yeah, I'll push back a little bit just as someone, I'll push back a little bit on this and say that one of the reasons we don't know about how fast their processing speed is, how accurate their processing actually is, has more to do with the range of coverage disguises and coverage types that you don't see in college, but
Sure.
you see in greater detail in the
1,000%
NFL.
also that. Yeah.
So a good example of, I'm gonna give you the kind of the pluses and minuses just as quickly with this with quarterback stuff. One of the things that I have done in the past several years has been providing scouting reports to quarterback coaches to early round quarterbacks. Brock Purdy was probably the first, and he wasn't an early round quarterback, but he's proven himself well. And so I've been someone who's been a consultant on that and provided early stuff, and they often will take the things that I look at and compare it to what the quarterback says. They'll ask them, "What did you see on this play? What were
Yeah.
you looking
Mhm.
at? How are you doing that?" And it's fared well enough that I continue to be doing it, just to keep it without going,
Yeah. Yeah.
over the
Yeah.
top about that. But what I would say is, while that's been helpful with Caleb Williams or Brock Purdy or players, on that level, and you can see where there's issues easily. Like you can see where there's issues easily. The problem is when you get a player who lacks experience. And so, like for me, Anthony Richardson is a guy that I liked a lot
Yeah.
and had a high score for. And I often said he's inexperienced, he's not raw. It's a slight distinction, but it's an important one. And the way that I would note that is that you can see that when he understands what the defense is, that he can do things on and off script against certain blitz looks, against certain disguises, and with pressure going on and combine different skills and process fast. But what you can't see is when they decide that they're going to um, do things that he hasn't seen yet. And so that's where maybe one of the things I'm looking at down the line, and I plan on doing this year, is I kind of like Drew Brees' theory of you need about 50 or 60 games combined, college and pro, to be able to see whether the quarterback is for the quarterback to have really grasped offensive football in terms of the processing and understanding everything. So what I plan on doing is, there's certain areas of things that I look at with decision making, with game management, with coverage recognition, with processing speed. And you can, one of the things that I've often been, my buddy Dwayne McFarland would often say, what people don't realize is they see you as a film guy, but you're actually an analytics person and they don't see that. And I'm like, well, I've smiled and I said, well, tell me what you see. And he said, everything you do is taking subjective material and you're literally defining it and you're putting a weight value towards it and
Correct.
you're looking at those things. So like, you can look at processing speed, and if you look at the film well enough and you define it clearly enough, you can see whether they have a fast processor. The problem is again, is that processor going to be fast when they start to have new things thrown at them? And the answer
Right.
is probably not. And then you're gonna, and then teams get impatient. But I mean, yeah. So there's ability to an extent that's helpful, but if they don't have a certain number of starts and they haven't seen enough, then you have to. The next thing that I'm trying to solve for and trying to understand is how many games do I need? Or at least range of games do I need to see to project? Okay, where this player is going to get comfortable and will he get them? So, like a first year starter who's at he's watched 14 games. He's played 14 games. Say it's Ty Simpson, and that's all he's played. Then he's going to need three. He's going to need basically 2 more years for us to see if he gets comfortable. And if it's a disaster where he is, that might really impact his ability to see and to be confident with what he's doing. Because it's not only what you see on a whiteboard; it's the confidence to deliver it at speed. Brett Favre didn't know coverages early on in his career, and he threw lots of interceptions, but the confidence to deliver the ball and continue to do so without overthinking it. He's not a neurotic human being, and we can see that even off the field with his behavior. That there's probably not there's some if you argue there's some unconscionable behavior with some of the things that he did. That's kind of the opposite of being neurotic because you hem yourself in from doing things that you shouldn't do. But when you're a quarterback who's thrown more interceptions than anybody in history, but you're also a three-time MVP, and you also put your team on your back when there's lots of other things going on, well, obviously he doesn't hesitate even when he screws up. And as
Yeah.
a performer, that's a very important thing. And I've noted that once. It was funny because Kurt Warner was like, "Amen to that." When he saw that, because he was like, it's not just about whether you throw interceptions, it's about how fast you process and you don't let it impact you. And so quarterbacks who have lesser starts, when this thing happens, they can wind up in a situation where they overthink. And you want players who are like, I'm not bothered by the fact that I screwed this up. I'm going
Yeah.
to remain confident. So
I,
those
I,
are
I
things
guess
you're looking for.
I guess I would say that we probably have this inability with all positions to actually know what their makeup is, to really know whether or not they're going to eat, drink, live, sleep sports and football, and getting better and all this stuff. Is the money going to get to them? Is there's a lot of tertiary questions that you could ask that if I could ask them and know the answer, that might be very helpful. Like if I could
It's
literally quantify, is this guy going to be a knucklehead and has a gambling problem or whatever? Like a million questions I could
yeah,
ask, and just if I had a questionnaire on each player, and they'd be like, "Well, sort of on this game, like, sort of. He sort of has a gambling problem." Like that'd be a big deal. How do we know? We don't know that, right?
that's
So all these
it's
things,
the
I would
great
just say,
divide. That's what
right,
I've written about. Yeah,
right. I
it's
would
a
just say
great
that
divide.
maybe at the quarterback position, those things tend to impact winning and success at maybe the most drastic of all the positions we're talking about. Certainly,
I think,
even the
yeah.
wide receiver, we almost want him to be a little bit of a diva. Hey, give me the fucking ball, jerk off. I'm open. You kind of need that to be great, almost. Whereas that attitude may not play as a quarterback so much, right? So it's just interesting.
Yeah, it is absolutely, and I love that you brought that up, and that's why teams spend so much time on character. But
Hmm.
what's even funnier is that, people I know, one of my earliest clients from like 2000, since 2007, worked for, he's no longer in the league, but he had NDAs with about 30 different teams. He was, he basically he was both a scout and did analytics work. He did high-end analytics work for years, and he was one of those guys that the scouts didn't poo poo in terms of what he did. They respected him because they knew he understood the game. He played football at a high level, and he worked directly for GMs. He wasn't working either, he wasn't like doing QA work. He was literally doing high end work involving a variety of levels of play, combining film and analytics. And one of the things that he said to me, he says about character, he said, the problem with the NFL is that all too often the the executives give the scouts um, carte blanche to make decisions about what they've observed when they've interviewed, and they either don't have them they either don't understand how to interview, haven't trained them on how to interview. They don't know themselves how to interview, and they don't
Absolutely
know how
right.
to take the information and say, this is problematic, this is not. So the good teams use law enforcement specialists, they use
Yes.
organizational psychologists, industrial psychologists, and they let those people make the decisions about what actually is going on here, because you can get two players together. And just a quick example I've often used is, this was stated to me is like, imagine going to, Athens, Georgia. I'm going to Athens, Georgia on an assignment to study a player, and I've heard that, you know, rumblings that he's a partier. So, I asked the recruiting head, I asked some of the players, I asked some of the equipment people, and what I find out is that, yeah, he likes to go out like 4 or 5 times a week. And I decide, yep, he's a partier, cross him off our list. We don't want him. Then if someone else comes along and say you come along, Scott, and you go, all right, I ask all those questions, and then I ask, so where does he go? Oh, there's this place on Broad Street that he goes to. Okay, so you go there, and they're not open quite yet, but all the staff's there, and you ask them, so what does he do? What do you see? You know this guy? Yeah, he comes in 4 or 5 times a week. Okay, so can you tell me about what he does when he comes in? Yeah, he shows up at about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. He's usually got two or three of his friends with him. Um, he sits down here at the back of the room with a table. Girls and different guys come by and talk to him, and he talks to them. He may buy them a drink, and then he leaves somewhere between 9:30, and he's gone. Ever have any trouble with him here? No, not a lick. Does he drink? Nope. He brings a bottle of water with him, and he
Right.
never drinks.
Right.
And he's a good tipper. And then that's
All the
and
stories were true, but one told you to do one thing and one told you to do the other. Exactly. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And these are things that happen because remember, these scouts, many of them are 25 to 30 years old. They're making about 30 to 40 grand probably at this point. They're entry level, and they're asked to be in parsing advanced information
Yeah.
that maybe they shouldn't, or it's a GM who was, raised in football, but doesn't have any real management interviewing, skill. And they've read a couple
Right.
of books, and they feel like they've stayed at a Holiday Inn Express, and now they have a
Yeah.
doctorate in this area.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
so
No,
that's what
absolutely.
happens.
That's the wizardry of all this. And that's also, I would say, from our perspective, because we don't really have a direct, me personally, at the OTC, we don't have a direct link to being able to solve this.
Right.
We don't have that. So we're just going to call that luck and variance and move on from there. But it is some of the most interesting stories. Of course, the most legendary of all time was the Jamarcus Russell. They gave him blank video cassettes. Back then it wasn't even DVDs. They were just, VCR tapes or whatever. They just gave him blank VCR tapes labeled like, zone coverages or something like that. And they're like, here, go watch this shit. And he was like, what'd you think? He was like, loved it. Got it all down pat right up here. Got it. They were fucking blank. So, this is, this is what it is. You never know. Like,
Yeah.
so anyway, let's get into it. I do think there is one, um, tier one prospect based off of my numbers and based off what I'm doing and what I see, and that's Jeremiah Love. You tiptoed with him. You were fine with that. So that's close enough for me. We'll get to the wide receivers in just a moment. But I think, if we're talking about Jeremiah Love, I do think he is, elite. I mean, yeah, why not? So I think he does everything. What is it that I could point to that says, no, this is the area in which I see some issue? I don't. Size, speed, missed tackles forced, big playability, catching the football, draft capital, right? Like health. Health has been pretty good. I mean, he got a little knocked up once there, but I think he's pretty strong there. Like there hasn't been a major red flag. Is there anything that gives you any pause with Jeremiah Love?
No, nothing gives me any
Okay.
pause at all.
Yeah.
He's in the same tier as guys like, Saquon Barkley, Nick Chubb, guys in the past like that, Jameer Gibbs,
Yeah. Okay.
Bijan
Cool.
Robinson.
Same.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just
Okay.
the things that he has. He's no prospects perfect, but he
No.
just has lapses. There's lapses, there's habits, and then there's like serial problems. And lapses are just like every once in a while you'll see something that you go, would have liked to have seen him do this or do
Sure.
that, and that's all it is. So yeah, he's a very clean and good prospect.
So, okay, let's move on because I don't think there's much to behold there. I think he's going to be awesome. Everybody knows it. But I think the question I have is outside of Jeremiah Love, if I told you, so there's two ways, I'm going to ask you two questions. This is the first one. If I told you that there was a running back from this class that in 2 years from today was a top 10 dynasty running back, which would be pretty awesome, who would you think that would be?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
He's not my number two back,
That's right. That's right. I'm not
but
asking for number two.
but
That's
he's
right.
but he's not my number two back, but he is my number three back
Okay.
because I think my answer would probably be, if I was going to give like just a basic answer, it would be none of the above. But I
Correct. I
would
agree,
say,
by the way. Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
it'd be none of the above. But if I'm going to pick someone who I think has that upside in their game and things just fall the right way,
Yeah.
it's going to be Damon Claiborne of Wake Forest, who's
Mm.
5'10", 188. And that's part of the problem, is that you look at the weight and you go, is he going to get the touches to do this? But when you watch his game, I think pound for pound, he's the best playmaker on the board. And his weight may not wind up being a limitation, only because because of his quickness, because of his speed, and because of how fast he processes the game and what he can do as a receiver, he's that type of player that if you can get him within range of 195, 200 pounds, and you you have something there. Because looking at his track record of touches, when backs have a high touch count, and they've proven it in college at a high level, that works out well. Jamal Charles is a good example of that, you know, but they tend to get that workload in the NFL. And Damon Claiborne has a high workload. Um, and you see the skills that he has overall. I look at him as one of those players who I joke that he's kind of like LaShawn McCoy, kind of like Shady Light in terms of size, but maybe more like you think of how James Cook landed in the right offense with his size to be able to produce at a high level, or Charlie Garner, like later in his career when he went to the Raiders and the 49ers. I think that this kid has that kind of skill set to develop and to become that kind of player if he can stay healthy, which he has, and he can have a team that says, okay, we can work with you with what we have here, because he's a very good interior runner,
Mm.
very skilled at setting up blocks, being able to deal with penetration, being able to work against unblocked defenders. He processes the game fast. He has a really good understanding of how to use pacing to set up those creases or set up defenders. And, you know, even though the biggest concern I'd have with him is that he fumbled the ball 7 times last year. And I would normally look at his fumble rate and say it's kind of on the edge of where I've done studies over the past 10 years. And while it's not a clean correlation, there's some signal that there's a lot of noise to what I'm going to share.
Yeah.
But he's if you I've looked at the past 10, 15 years of running backs and seen that any running back who's been below one fumble per 61 touches as a career number in college, they have about a 10% chance of even being a running back 3 in fantasy. They have
Yeah.
a 1% chance of being a top 12 running back. So it he's close to that number, but not he's above it. So I'm not, but the closer you are to that number, the more concerned I am.
Yeah.
But the thing is his number was much higher heading into last year with still a high level of workload. He just had it's possible he had a bad year, whereas somebody else we'll talk about, is below that number and they've been bad every year.
I'm going to circle back to Damon Claiborne, but I want to ask maybe the follow up question to give the context I'm looking for, and hopefully the listeners will appreciate. Because then there's the other question. Then there's the question like, if I told you there was a running back from this class that's not Jeremiah Love, that would still be getting NFL carries. Like he's 30 years old in the league and meaningful. Not a Frank Gore type. I'm not. He doesn't have to be, but Frank Gore. David Montgomery's going to keep going. Like these guys that basically stand the test of time. That actually are just fuck, man. They're good. He plays still. He's still in the league. Like that would pertain to the fact that he's probably healthy and solid and NFL ready type of player. Who do you think that would be? 8 to 10 years from now, he's still getting meaningful NFL carries at 30 years old.
Emmett Johnson of Nebraska. Because people look at the RAS score and they go, oh, it's in the 32nd percentile or something of that nature. But as good as the RAS score can be in certain levels as a layer of information, let's remember that a couple of things. You want to score the play. You're trying to, when you're tracking data of like workout data, you want that workout data to apply to the way the player plays. And one of the big lessons that I think that I remember that I was reinforced for me was Dalvin Cook way back in the day. When I studied Dalvin Cook, I had a strong grade for him. When the combine hit, there were a lot of people who were like, listen, his spark score is low, his 3-cone drill is awful, his vertical is bad. We might need to get off that bandwagon. But when you watch Dalvin Cook, one of the things that you notice is that
He was
he
awesome.
doesn't he
Yeah.
was awesome, but
Yeah.
he doesn't deliver lateral cuts. He's not
Right.
a lateral cut runner. And when you look at 3-cone drill, that's what it's trying to approximate.
Yeah.
So you have to look at that and go, if he never delivers he doesn't use jump cuts, he doesn't use lateral cuts, he uses curvilinear movement. There's nothing here measuring curvilinear movement
Right.
in the combine. And that's his primary method. To me, that meant you've got to throw out using that metric to measure him, or
Yeah.
else you're being biased against his running style that has proven it works. I mean,
Right.
you can go to YouTube right now, and I talk about how his feet do this when he's not doing curvilinear movement. He's just changing direction. He literally runs in place and moves his feet to where he wants to go. It's the weirdest thing I've ever seen
Yeah.
from a running back since I've been watching running backs. Well, Emmett Johnson has a bad 3-cone drill, and his first mode of operation is curvilinear movement. He's also a fast processor. He
Yeah.
understands what happens pre-snap, and he has solutions for it. He can cut, so he has it in his bag. And so could Chris Carson, who had a 7.53 3-cone, or Kenneth Gainwell, who also had like 7.3s. In that range. So you don't necessarily, what I'm looking for is the minimum barrier to entry in terms of that. Because, like, I don't, if you tell me a guy's in the 32nd percentile in a metric, and I say, well, what's the minimum metric for someone that you should say be able to contribute on the field,
Yeah.
meaningful statistics, and you say oh, it's the 11th percentile.
Right.
Then why
Yeah.
do I give a fuck about whether it was the
Yeah.
32nd
That's right.
percentile in the
Yeah.
history of things?
I
So,
think,
yeah,
I started to look at this stuff, I'm not alone. A lot of us have looked at, hey, do these things actually matter? Is there any, if there's not even any correlation, let alone causation, then we shouldn't be looking at it. There's not even correlation to a lot of those things with, burst. And I would say more to what you're saying. It's whether or not the way that they play justify that. Like if you've got a guy who all he does is like rip big runs, and all of a sudden he runs a 4.7. You're like, actually, not so sure this guy's going to be able to do that at that level. Maybe he was playing at a lesser level.
right.
Maybe we need to watch this film again. Maybe he had a bad day running, but something doesn't jive here. We need to reconcile this. You get my point. Like I told the story a couple weeks ago or last week about Kamani Vidal, how I watched Kamani and I was like, dude, this guy's a technician. He's just so good between the tackles. You watch the way he moves. He gets chased down by every linebacker. Like he's not fast. I don't care if he's not fast. I don't care. He's awesome. I love him as a player. Then he goes out running like a 4.4. I was like, wait, he's fast? I didn't see that on tape. And
Right.
it didn't matter because that was irrelevant somewhat because I didn't suspect him to be fast. And the fact that he was a little faster than I thought he was based off what I saw in the film was like, all right, fine, whatever. But it wasn't that I needed him to be fast because of the way he played. I don't know if that
Yeah.
makes any sense.
No, it makes perfect sense, and I think that that's the thing is that when you also the thing that needs to be understood is, and I think Brandon Angelo, my podcast partner, who is a former track athlete in the Big Ten, and also former football player, and who works with um, pro athletes, helping them recover from injury and train with them and things like that. One of the first things on our first pod he talked about is that, we need to understand that the NFL combine, when they measure times, they're using second or third rate equipment. They're not using the top rate equipment, and that the error rate, the variation from
Yeah.
that is enough to be the difference between what we would
Yeah.
call a great time and a time that we'd say, oh, they're an undrafted free agent.
Yeah.
And so that's important. And then the other thing is when you look at Emmett Johnson and you say 7.32 cone, he's the only player at that position who ran the 3 cone.
Yeah.
Nobody runs the 3 cone because they're
Nope.
scared shitless to run
They
it.
are. Yep.
Because it requires a level of training to perform the task
Yep.
that's addition to it's not a football oriented task.
That's
So
right.
now so it's a too much of a stretch to call it an approximation of the abilities that are there. So if the player does it well, I am definitely counting that as a good value thing if I'm seeing it on the film because
Right.
look, they learned how to do it
He look,
and they're showing it and they're showing they can do it. But
I
if
don't
they're
know.
bad,
I don't know enough of Emmett Johnson's film, but I've seen enough to know he's a pretty good mover. That's for sure.
yes,
So I'm not worried about his 3 cone based off of that when I've seen enough on the film. So I'd prefer if you don't even mention this fucking 3 cone anymore because I don't think it's valuable
yeah,
and I don't think you need to defend it because it's irrelevant to the way that I would take Emmett Johnson and I would give you Bucky Irving because one of the things that happened to me with Bucky Irving was we loved, and I say we, there was a lot of us, in our group here that really loved Bucky Irving before the draft and the combine. We're like, oh my god, this guy, dude, look at him play! Like everything he did looks so good on the football field. Then he ran slow and got drafted late, and we are like, oh my god, we're afraid, and we pulled back and we stopped, you know, backing Bucky Irving as a prospect so much so that we actually overcorrected, missed the opportunity for like I'm an idiot. I looked at that and I said, look, take each data set and maybe value them all, including your original take that he's good. And I would say the same thing with Emmett Johnson. If you're completely pulling off of Emmett Johnson because of a 3 cone, you're an idiot. It's like pulling off
right,
of Harold Fannin because of a duck-footed gauntlet. It makes
yep,
no sense. Of course, he's not going to be perfect at everything. So at the end of the day, I do think there's something there with Emmett Johnson. Here's what I'm going to push back on both players, not because I disagree, because I think it's a bad class. But I'm just gonna ask you what you think because at this particular point with Damon Claiborne, here's what I don't like about his profile, and what I need you to help me with is two things. I'm going to start with the first one. They probably actually I'll tell you them both. maybe they have something to do with one another. But here's a player who I have no problem with at 5'10", 190, call it 5'10", 188. 5'10", 190 is really small for the NFL, but yet we've been seeing smaller and smaller running backs with BMIs rivaling his become successful, whether it be, Devon Achan and James Cook, as you pointed out, Bucky Irving, the aforementioned, even Christian McCaffrey came in the league a little bit lighter. Those guys have all found success being lighter. He runs that 4.37. All that sounds great. He has some good things on his profile, but the two things that stand out are his yards per carry for his career are 4.7. Now, I'm not a yards per carry zealot. I'm not even here saying that that's a predictive stat and that if you don't have a good yards per carry, that you're not good. I will say that generally, the best backs in the NFL have had good yards per carry at college. So that's a little bit of a red flag. The other one is he's one of the worst in the class at 15-yard run rate for his career at only just over 6%, which is not good. And for a guy who runs 4.37, who's going to make his hay with, presumably from my perspective, being able to hit some big plays, what do you attribute some of that lack of success at the college level?
Sure. It's a great question. And I think that two things. I mean, I think when you talk about, yards per carry, it is so offensive line dependent.
Sure,
So
absolutely.
that's a
Yep.
massive part of it. And then it is related to when you start looking at big play runs,
Yeah.
also
Agreed.
dependent on offensive line. And you have to remember that he's playing in the toughest division in football. And they are, usually a second rate or third rate team facing
Yep.
defenses like that. And one of the things that I've always studied and that I've had success with is looking at the the, the decision making, the footwork mechanics, the pad level, the alignment of the player, looking at all these different types of skills and concepts and techniques with the football player. And I found that the player can be on a team that's overmatched routinely. And if they do well, I don't really worry about that stuff because, for instance, three players that I think that come to mind for me track record wise were Ahmad Bradshaw, um, Joseph Adai, and Matt Forte. I remember watching all those guys where they would face I remember Matt Forte playing LSU's defense, and everyone on LSU's team, sans the kicker, could lift more and was more powerful in testing than all the offensive linemen on Tulane. And LSU's defense was the monster defense with Glenn Dorsey up front, and they were a national championship, record-setting defense. And Matt Forte averaged less than 2 yards per carry, I believe, in that game, and watched the decision making that he had, and it was one of the more impressive games. The same was true with Ahmad Bradshaw, watching him against Philip Fulmer's Tennessee defense. That was a top rated defense, and he averaged less than 3 yards per carry and was often getting met in the backfield, and was also very impressed with him. And the same with Joseph Adai against Auburn's defense under um, whoever that whoever that crazy senator is, that is now a senator of Alabama who used to be their coach.
Tuberville.
Yeah, Tuberville. Now under Tuberville, and they were also a league leading defense at that time, and a die averaged like 2.9 yards per carry in that. So when to me, in contrast, I looked at Darren McFadden, or I looked at some other players who had, strong numbers, or Tevin Coleman or somebody like that. They'd
Yeah.
have strong numbers, but the way they earned their yardage, the way they made decisions, really, the way they made decisions were more problematic. And you could say, well, they could be good in certain settings, but there's certain settings that they may struggle. And even the settings that they're actually in right now, like the scheme they're in, they may struggle in the pros because they're getting by on athletic ability. They're not getting by on understanding the concept of the run, understanding how to deal with unblocked defenders. So that's kind of for me, when I look at those things, that's where looking at decision making, game management technique can really come into play, because then when they play teams that are less than, and you see them have the big play gains, and the decision making is consistent with the big play moments as they are in the plays where they get stuffed, but they're on the right track with that because the difference variable is the offensive line. So if you're looking at the right techniques, it kind of exposes the variable that's getting in the way or helping. And that's kind of how I see that with the guy.
And then is Emmett Johnson your RB2? Is that
He is.
yeah.
He
I've
is.
heard a lot of people who really like Emmett Johnson, and it sounds like, count you among them. Um, let me ask you this about the
But let's
class. Yeah, go ahead.
let's just add one thing.
Please.
When we look at the class, ranking, I think rankings suck. So
Yeah, yeah,
like
that's why
so
that was my
so
next
when you
question. So, yeah, go ahead.
when you ask about
Yeah.
the strength of the class, you know, Emmett Johnson and Damon Claiborne are just under what I would call an immediate starter. They could contribute right now in a committee, and if you don't have a good starting running back, then they could start for you and probably deliver for you. But they've got some things to work on that they may or may not get better at. But they're not a plug in. They're not a plug in, and they automatically take over for an established starter if you drafted them, or even a good, really good journeyman starter. They might still need a year or two to really develop those skills if they do at all. So this class is not on paper as good as other classes, but I will say from just my looking at it over the years, over the past 15 years, it's kind of plus or minus one running back
Yeah.
because, so when we talk about a bad class, if the midline of like an average class is X, then it's X minus one is a bad class, X
Yeah.
plus one is a good class. So
It's true.
I think that's kind of where we are, but I think there are enough players just below the starter tier who are in the contributor range that we could wind up surprised by this class and say it's better than we thought. But I don't think but from a year one dynasty standpoint, if you're looking for somebody who's going to give you instant impact, mm, it's most likely Love, and that's about it. But then but then you have guys who could play that Kyle Manon guy role who get picked up later, and you go, oh, okay, I've got low end running back to production here. That helped me out. That's great. Maybe they can grow from there.
I made my hot take on JJ Zacharyason's podcast when he had me was that there would be the fewest number of day one and day two running backs drafted in this particular class than ever in history. I assume it's ever in history. I've only looked back like 10, 15 years or something, and it's like four. Maybe I would highly doubt that the further you go back in history, that there was ever a time when there were only three running backs taken in the first round. I just think that's not possible.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
especially in
further
the
back we go.
environment that it was further back.
Right.
That was
Right.
running back was it.
Right.
Yeah.
So I didn't look all the way back, admittedly, but I basically, whatever, in modern history, that it would set the record, if not history forever. And, obviously when you've got one that's going to go in the top 10, it's actually somewhat bold because it's not like, well, let's see when the first one goes. We know it's going to be like in the first four picks, but I think it could get really thin from there where teams are just like, nah, and maybe there's one or two more taken. Do you agree with that? Or what are your thoughts
Well,
about the way the NFL sees this class? Is the same?
I totally agree that it'll probably
Yeah.
be a low amount because
Yep.
I think that a lot of teams like Jadarian Price, teams get hot and bothered about the sidekick to the star.
Yeah.
Whether it's Rashawn Johnson or whether Felix Jones or
Yeah.
there tends to be that
There's a
kind of
long
thing.
history. Yeah.
There's a history with that.
Yeah, there
And I
is.
like Jadarian Price, but
Yeah.
I'm not that high on him. But I think that we'll see like a Jadarian Price go in maybe the third round, and then we'll see maybe an Emmett Johnson go in the fourth round or the fifth round, somebody like that, or Mike Washington or a Nicholas Singleton, maybe some players who are
Yeah.
established might go between rounds 4 or 5. But I think, yeah, I mean, if you look at last year, one of the things that I talked about a lot was that, um, is that we had a lot of players who were very good. It was a rich class, but because the nature of the NFL, a lot of them are going to get drafted after the fifth, fourth and
Yeah, they
fifth
have to.
round.
Right, exactly
Yeah,
right.
and that's the valuation of the position more than
Yeah,
anything, not the talent level. And it's
right.
so if this class is not as strong on a certain level, then yeah, it's probably going to be similar or worse. So I totally agree.
Because I say that, and I think if you agree, then actually, my RB2 and my RB8, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah,
You
that's
you
exactly.
could take you could take either one. If you told me my RB8 was my RB2, I'd be like, sure, fine, whatever. Let's just do
Yeah.
that then.
I would probably say
Somewhere in there.
I'd say that's very true, and I think
Yeah,
that's very true every year in certain respects.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, like the separation between my running back 2 and my running back 5 is less than half of a point in my depth
yeah.
of talent scale, and that means that it's just how their talents are arranged differently, depends on
Sure.
what flavor you want. And
Right.
then below that, if it's a point or 2 difference, then it's more about, okay, so it's not that different, but it's about what is it they're missing one thing, and do you think that that
Yeah.
thing's gonna work out all right for you?
Speaking of missing something, I Jadarian Price is an interesting prospect. I do want to hear your take on Jadarian Price. I have heard from a number of people that I've had on this program, and there have been differing takes already. I've heard, John Lobb say that basically this guy was the mop up duty guy, and then I've got which is fair, and then I've got a guy who's a Notre Dame guy who was on last week, and Marcus Gailey, who said I don't really see that. I do think he was playing meaningful moments, spelling Jeremiah Love, not just mop up duty late against bums. He said, so I thought I saw him playing against the upper level competition just as much as Jeremiah Love, or at least, somewhere thereabouts, not completely a second fiddle in that way. And I thought that, I don't know. I haven't looked at the stats on that. I do see that when I look at some of the things that matter to the anatomy, right? I do the anatomy every year, and all the anatomy does, it takes the top, in this case, 15 running backs in the NFL, the top 15 dynasty assets at running back position, and I just put all what they were as prospects into the metrics machine, and it spits out what they were. What was their average missed tackles force per rush? What was their worst of that group missed tackles force per? You get my drift, right? What were the characteristics shared by all these players? And you know, Jadarian Price has a lot of them. Let me just tell you that much. He breaks tackles, or forces missed tackles, I should say, because they're not breaking tackles. He also has the highest career 15-yard run rate in the class at 11%. Has a really strong 10-yard run rate at 19%, almost 20%. Obviously the pass catching's not there. He's a little bit smaller, but still big enough. 5'11", 203, runs a 4.49. Like, there's not much there except for the receiving, number one, which is not good, basically non-existent, I should say, and the fact that the raw numbers aren't there. So we've never seen him do what a big boy needs to do, and that is carry the load. We've never seen that. And for those reasons, we're skeptical. But are there more reasons to be skeptical, Mr. Matt Waldman?
Um, Not really. I mean, I think that again, he's at best he's a leak out receiver on screens and wide routes. That's about it. That's what you're going to get out of him. The route running, maybe there's a little potential there for him to develop because he does flip his hips effectively for flat breaks and speed turns against linebackers that play off of him, and he shows a little bit in terms of some receiver like skills that you can build on, but it's not
Sure.
proven. And teams tend to be like, we want the proven guy that we're going to insert this stuff into,
Yep.
insert him into the offense like that. But I think if he's one of those guys that could develop behind the scenes, and then the team,
Yeah.
switches up. Maybe they switch coaching staffs, or maybe the staff looks at him and goes, "Oh, you know what? He's a better receiver than we thought. We like what
Sure.
we see here." Um, his blocking's reasonably good. So I mean, I think that there's a little bit of work to, he's got to learn how to punch. He's got to learn how to, um, you know, do a little bit more in terms of diagnostic things. He can be a little bit slow to move to a defender, working around the edge after he sets up, things like that. But no, I mean, I think he's a good player. He's a contributor off the bench. He can start if you need him to, but there's nothing major with him. I would call it that his game is the thing that's separating him from the starters is that he's not showing anything on a high level that the starters often do, and that he has small lapses with a variety of things that kind of hold him back right now from being consistent at what he does. To me, like if I were going to give a range of comparisons, I would say at the comparison that he's never going to attain is Terrell Davis. At the comparison that he's unlikely to sink down to will be George Holani of the Seattle Seahawks, who's a special teamer who can give you value and kind of sneaky good. He's somewhere between Ty Chandler and Jonathan Franklin, the former Packers running back who only had a couple games before a neck injury. Someone who you put in and give him the load, and he's going to give you some moments that people are going to get excited about, but he's got a little bit more to learn. And I'd say the only thing that I saw that was like kind of a diagnostic thing that's more conceptual is that he doesn't get his feet get too wide apart when he gets stuck with something. Like he doesn't when he doesn't see it right, his feet get far apart, and then he can't really explode laterally in one direction or the other, and he gets stuffed because um it's kind of like some sort of fatal error in your computer. Like his computer up here between his ears experiences some sort of blue screen, and now his feet are too wide apart, and the defense basically unplugs him at that point.
I had tweeted when I started to download all the data on these players. I said, boy, and it's ironic because the Seattle Seahawks have 3 picks in this draft. That's it. The 32nd, the 64th, and I think like the 96th, whatever. I think they just have 1, 2, 3. And so that's it. And I've seen Daniel Jeremiah mock Jadarian Price to them at pick 32, which is bold. But nonetheless, I've seen many mock him or others to the Seattle Seahawks at pick 64, that sort of last pick of the second round. Before, even Ken Walker had left Seattle, I had tweeted Jadarian Price has to be as good as Ken Walker. Is he as good a prospect as Ken Walker was?
No.
Because in order to be that type of player, he has to be Ken Walker. Because Ken Walker was the guy who had, limited pass game stuff, but was a real ripper, on the ground and just a beast. And of course, I would agree that he's not. But tell us how close or far he is from a player like Ken Walker as a prospect.
Yeah, Ken Walker. Let me look at where I scored him because I have it right here. And
Cool.
if I get a little bit closer, I'm getting
And then
close.
maybe sort of you can transition that question while you're looking. You can transition that question to if they were to take him at either of those first 2 picks, and of course the C's open up at that point. Charbonnet on the shelf. I tend to think he's going to be grossly overpriced because people are going to have the stars in the skies as their sight line as to what's going to happen to Jadarian Price in that offense. But it could be a little bit disappointing, from the best case scenario with Jadarian Price in Seattle. What are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that
yeah, I
pick?
think Jadarian Price is probably, he's good enough right now that you look at him and you think of what did Isaiah Pacheco do his first year?
Yeah,
That kind of thing. He's probably in that range of player
yeah,
right now, and maybe could grow from there. Um, but relative to Kenneth Walker, I had as my number 2 back behind Brees Hall, and it was basically one thing maybe different, but he was at a score of 88 out of
it's good.
100, which
Yeah,
is 90 is franchise player.
yeah,
And I have Jeremiah Love at 89.
yeah,
And I have Ken Walker at 88.
yep,
So you can kind of see where that air is in terms of what's going on. Whereas, you look at the player that Jadarian Price is, and you could say that the players that are in the range of who were good. Isaiah Pacheco had an 81 on
yeah,
my score. He was my 9th rated player. I have Jadarian Price a couple points higher than that, um, putting him maybe just above where Zamir White was, or just below Brian Robinson Jr.
sure,
Players who can give you. We've
yeah,
seen the value, in either in flashes or for a season. in Robinson's case,
Yeah,
but it just didn't, but it hasn't worked out long term because, again, more players come in the league, as you
that's
said,
it, maybe.
and they're more talented, and
Yes,
that's kind of what it happens because this is running back. I often say it's like a casting call in Hollywood,
yes, sir.
and you can have Robert De Niro and Gary Oldman and Dustin Hoffman and all those guys in a room, and you can add a bunch of other names to that in the room, and you can say, what do you really want, in this, and some guys are right for the part and some guys aren't,
Well,
but
and then all of a sudden Daniel Day-Lewis walks in and everybody's got to go home.
that's right.
That's right.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, excuse me, we're going to use Daniel Day-Lewis, as it
Yep.
were. So thank you very much for showing up. Yeah, he's a 99 on the prospect profile. I can
Right.
promise you. Um, the other, one that's pretty divisive is Nicholas, or Nick, as I call him. I'm old school. Nick Singleton. I'm not calling him Nicholas. This is crazy. Saint Nicholas, maybe. He's Nick Singleton. It's the way it's supposed to roll off the tongue. Maybe that's why he had the bad 2 seasons. I don't know. Matt Waldman, Nick Singleton, if you just took his freshman season, maybe not on film, I don't know. I didn't watch, but I'm just saying, if you take that freshman season and I tell you the story, he's the 101 in this class after that moment, right? Everybody was like, wow, this is the Nick Singleton class. And it wasn't even this class, it was last year because he would have been a junior coming out. Yet here we are, and we're all kind of like, not so sure about this guy. Yet he does have some pretty prolific stats that he's put up in both his freshman and junior year. What's the real Nick Singleton?
I think the real Nick Singleton is a better player than how Penn State used him. And I watched Nick Singleton after his freshman year, and I studied his film alongside Quinshon Judkins, and I favored Judkins just by a little bit.
Yeah.
But so, do I think Quinshon Judkins is an absolute stud of a player? Not necessarily, but he's very good at what you ask him to do. And I had him. I still had him high on my board, and he's a near franchise player, but he's not. There, you look at where he's at, and I would say, there are certain things that he expresses that franchise ability with the right fit. Whereas, there's some players who you have at that number, and they're scheme versatile.
Yeah.
So when with Singleton to me is in that group of players that are he's in my top 5, but he's in that group of players where you say, all right, he could start if you need him to. He's probably not going to start right away. If he'll probably land on a team where there is an established guy, and he could be a good backup who, if somebody gets hurt, gives you compelling numbers. I think he's versatile. His receiving skills out of the backfield are good. He can run through contact. He flips the field with his speed. It doesn't make him a breakaway runner necessarily like a Chris Johnson or a Jeremiah Love, but he's fast enough that he's going to force people to chase him down, and he gets big plays. But you think about Penn State. They had struggles at quarterback. They had struggles with their coaching. Um, they had him splitting time in their offense with Katron Allen, who is basically an aspiring Jerome Howard, or Jordan Howard.
Jordan
Jordan
Howard.
Howard, yeah.
Yeah.
He's kind of an aspiring Jordan Howard in some ways. And so I think that downgraded perceptions of his acclaim as a freshman because they didn't ride him hard. They put him in a committee, and they don't in college football. Recruiting is so important.
Yeah.
So when you're a running back, teams often say, look, we're going to pair you with another back because we want to give everybody an opportunity to play. We don't want to lose this guy to somebody else unless
Right.
they're so special. They go, you know what, forget it. We don't. But even then, like I remember watching Nick Chubb and Sony Michel, and
Yeah.
I was a big Nick Chubb guy. And I
Yeah.
remember watching Sony Michel and thinking, oh, he's very good. But when people were like, oh yeah, Sony Michel is the better guy, I'm like, what the fuck are you looking at?
Yeah.
But I would often claim it was like, look, the Georgia has a strong recruiting program,
Yeah.
and they want to make sure that they aren't over, they aren't putting themselves in a situation where
Right.
they
Where they're
lose.
sacrificing that.
Yeah,
Right.
they're
Yeah.
sacrificing.
Putting that in jeopardy. Right.
Exactly.
So do you think that by definition, then you think Singleton's a better player than Katron Allen, and that Singleton has more to offer the NFL? I kind of agree with you here. I felt
Absolutely.
like Katron was maybe going to be the guy that you answered, to the second question, the floor question, the guy who just, hey man, I could see him getting carries forever. Like I've comped him to like the he has aspirations to be David Montgomery. Like if he could be David Montgomery, that'd be the best career Katron Allen could ever have. Like, and I actually think Jordan Howard is the same thing. Jordan Howard wishes he was Jordan David Montgomery too, right?
Yes.
Like right there. So
Yeah.
maybe he's Jordan Howard, maybe he's David Montgomery. He's probably Jordan Howard. I agree with that. That's a great, in other words, most of these guys are going to fail rather than succeed. They're mostly going to hit their lower to mid expectations than their absolute ceiling outcome. So I think that's about right. But
Yeah,
do you think?
I
Yeah,
have him as my comp from is Jonathan Williams
yeah,
for Katron Allen, and
yeah,
for Singleton, it's actually Melvin Gordon.
yeah,
Kind of more of a guy
yeah,
who he might be able to give you sneak into the top 10 occasionally, but if you think about Melvin Gordon's career, there's a lot of hype for him, but he
yeah.
wasn't as fast as people thought he was. He wasn't explosive as people thought he was. He was a better pass catcher than people thought because at Wisconsin and there wasn't a lot of opportunity there. But then when he comes into the game and he played, he eventually becomes a starter. He puts up big numbers for a year. He wants a bigger contract, and the Broncos are like, "We don't think you're an elite back, and we don't think you really deserve that number." And his career basically, kind of declined. Not precipitously
Right.
necessarily, but you could see that's where the declining point went because no team wanted to make him a top tier guy. They didn't see him as that. And I
Let,
think
let
that's
me
where Nicholas is.
let me tell you this. Nick Singleton, if you put him against all the dynasty, the anatomy running backs, the top 15, his profile stacks up very, very favorably.
Right.
He would be one of the lower on the board for 15-yard career run rate, which is actually kind of hilarious because he did have a couple of years, the freshman and junior year, with some bigger plays in it, but not as many in the sophomore senior seasons. Anyhow, whatever. But the other place that he doesn't necessarily shine is missed tackles forced. Um, and I don't love that. That's not something that gets me excited. There's another player that actually has is even worse than that, and that's Mike Washington, who is supposedly this big beast, but he also did not make people miss at the college level at any point in his career. Maybe a little tiny bit in his final season, but Anyway, long story short, what do you attribute that to? And I've heard a lot of people say that basically, Nick Singleton has bad vision. He's just a bad running back who's a good athlete. Would you like to dispel that,
Yeah, absolutely. I would. it's
please?
it's they used to been they basically split the workload between these guys and used a Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside type of approach with Singleton, and Katron Allen. And I think that offense is super predictable.
Mm,
And it's bad because their quarterback doesn't they scheme plays. So meaning that they don't have the quarterback read the field like a pro. They
right.
basically say, let's create some misdirection so that we give them one target to look to or two at best. And it's a more simplistic version of that. So good defenses look at that and go, all right, we just have to deal with the athletic ability of these players. If we get to our spot play disciplined defense, we're going to have the advantage pretty much regularly. So you'd have to be unbelievably good to actually produce at the level that people are expecting from a vision standpoint. His vision's just fine.
I
He
love it.
makes yeah, he makes his decision making is fine. I don't have any issue majorly with him in anything from that regard. And they like to use him on screens that counted as runs. So they throw it out to him, and if everybody knew it was coming, which is kind of predictable, then every it was like you looked at Ty Warren last year at tight end, and you go, okay, so this offense ran around Ty Warren, and it was like this, just let's scheme everything up for him and let him
Yeah.
do these things, and it wasn't all that impressive. It's Ty Warren's a good player, but he's also a player that it makes sense that he's in Indianapolis, and also I've said this in my visages on the posters in the post offices in both Happy Valley and in the Indianapolis County areas, surrounding areas, because I said Colston Loveland is a way better tight end than Ty Warren. Ty Warren's a good starter,
Yeah,
but Ty Warren is the let's get him into space, and now he's going to rumble, and you could give him a contested catch against zone, but don't ask him to run man to man. Watch the
right.
Steelers game and watch what the Steelers did against him, and
Yeah.
that's basically what happens when um, defenses can say we can shut down Jonathan Taylor early, and now we can just like tee off on Ty Warren early and limit his ability to get into space.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, obviously, Colson Loveland showing out now. I mean, with your boy, Luther Burden, huh? You excited for
Yeah,
Luther?
I'm excited for both of them, man. This is
Yeah, it's
the
gonna be
Ben
great.
Johnson was the great differentiator for all of this, and and I'm glad for Caleb Williams too, because the
Yes.
noise about him was just so silly.
Well, those fingernails are really problematic. I mean, that's a big
I
issue for me.
I know,
I
I
can't.
know.
Yeah, we're not going to be able to allow that. Um, I want to I want to do wide receivers, and I want to just do as much as we can on wide receivers. But
Sure.
I do have to ask you before we get to wide receiver. I'm going to ask you the big burning question about the tight end one in this class right after this. Welcome back to the program. I'm here with Matt Waldman. I was just about to ask him, am I crazy or am I not crazy about my Kenyon Sadiq take? So I'm just going to ask it straight away. Is Kenyon Sadiq a tier one, round one tight end prospect for the NFL?
I think he's a tier two guy. He's the top of tier two. Um, and I think that he can develop into a tier one guy. But right now, I would say he's aspiring to do what Delaney Walker did at his peak. Um, and if he can really just like lock his game in and be great, he could probably be a guy that we say, all right, is he in that Brock Bowers kind of range of ability? You could see Brock Bowers. I see Brock Bowers as that area that I'm not sure Sadiq's going to reach, but I think that his reasonable ability would be to be Delaney Walker at peak level and or better. The things that concern me about Kenyon Sadiq is we know that the speed's great. We know
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
watch it, but when you watch when the problem is like you'll see one route where you have him run like a return route, a whip route, like against a corner, and he wins and gets great separation, and the form's awesome. And then you'll see him read a zone. He doesn't read it quite well,
Mhm.
and he can't beat a linebacker on a seam route. Or he has difficulty with a safety who's playing a reasonable cushion, but he should blow by. And it's not because he's not fast enough; it's
Nope.
because he's just thinking slow.
Yep.
And he's the same thing goes with his hands. Like he can make tough catches, but he has some attack issues that he needs to clean up. His routes are the same thing. It's like there's some issues that need to be cleaned up. So I would say the reason that he didn't become a tier one receiver is the death by a thousand paper cuts kind of thing, where it's just small lapses everywhere that he needs to get better at, especially with the route running. Once he gets the route running nuances intact, if he can really develop those, you're going to see him advance to tier one. But say the difference between him and Eli Stowers, I would say, is that Stowers runs good routes. Um, and while he doesn't have the speed of Kenyon Sadiq, he gets late separation on targets. He runs good um, timing routes that matter. And then on top of that, he's as a former quarterback, he has some understanding of zone
Yeah.
coverage
Zone.
and
Yeah.
being able to understand where to beat it and communicate with what's going on with a
Yes.
quarterback with doing it. And he's very good after the catch in both contact balance and movement. Whereas Sadiq, I think, has some of that, but just the route's the big thing. He's got acrobatic gifts at the catch point, but until he can really tell a compelling story as a move tight end, he's going to get schemed open, kind of like think Gabriel Davis in his best year as a wide
He's
receiver.
ouch.
Where I'm sorry, I don't mean it
Yeah.
like in a bad way, but like how Gabe Davis had those
No, he's bad,
huge,
and
had
I used to
yeah,
love Gabe Davis just for fun, but
yeah,
now of course
but
we know.
but like you could misdirect him and give him these
Yeah.
huge chunk plays. Kenyon Sadiq's that guy that you can give
Yeah.
huge chunk plays to as he develops his route running. Fortunately,
Yeah.
his hands are way better than Gabe's.
Yeah, yeah. Well, look, the idea that I think you kind of answered it. The follow-up question I was going to ask, if Kenan Sadiq fails at the NFL, what will be the reason, right? I'm trying to figure out what are the shortcomings. It sounds to me like it's very easy. It's that he doesn't develop the route running nuance and all these other things that admittedly can be developed. I'm not saying you can't develop 4.39 speed. That doesn't get
No.
developed. So he has the raw materials that, as a scout. I mean, I used to have a friend who was, trying to play Major League Baseball, and he probably threw 90-ish, and he was, at the time, I think he was like 21 years old or whatever, 22 maybe, and 5'10". He wasn't even 6 feet. Went to a tryout. He was awesome. And after the tryout, the scout came up to him and goes, "Yeah, thanks for coming." He goes, "So nothing?" He goes, "You're 5'10", you threw 90, and you're 22 years old. Have a nice day, my friend."
Yeah.
In other words, they couldn't care less how good he was. They want an 18-year-old, 6'5" who throws 100. Don't even care if he can hit a barn. Just you teach him how to throw. The raw materials, I can't. That's the scout that gives you that. So he's a scout's dream in that way, that you just can't teach the things that Kenyon Sadiq are. Uh,
Yeah.
but
He's
I'm nervous, or at least skeptical, that he's going to actually get there, because these are actually things that we do see translate from college to the pros. Is target earning. Target earning is not like at one point you don't earn targets and all of a sudden you do. That's not really how it works. That's not, unfortunately or fortunately, however, that's not how it works. Target earners usually are target earners throughout, and guys who are lid lifters, I'm sorry, that's what you do. But in this case, you're not good against zone is a big problem, because the NFL plays 75% zone.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I think for me, what I've been telling people too is that you have to understand one of the things that I've added to the beauty of being able to study things with a certain set of criteria is that you could then change the algorithm of how you add all that
Yeah.
together.
Right.
So if you're really detailed about what you're studying and noting, which is what I try to do, I can look at it. And for years and years, I've been like, okay, move tight ends. Let's use the Bill Belichick theory. You draft move tight ends early. The guys who can block and catch, draft later. But now we're looking at the way football's being played, and this will be a little side note here. One of the reasons why Damon Claiborne might be okay weight wise is that when you look at the fact that defenses, at least for the next few years,
Yep.
are light, and their
Yes.
linebackers are the size of safeties, and some
Yes.
defensive linemen are actually the size of outside linebackers. And you're playing 12 personnel and 13 personnel. You have extra gaps, and you have ability to hide behind all of
Bingo.
that.
Yep.
That's where that can go in. But at the same time,
Absolutely. Yes.
because of this switch, more and more teams, Max Toscano with Matt Harmon's site, brought
Yeah.
up the idea. All right, look, AJ Barner was 14th. AJ Barner would never be mistaken for Kenyon Sadiq as an athlete. He's a
Nope.
big post up dude who has
Yep.
excellent hands. So there's two types of tight ends that we're looking
Yes.
for in fantasy. We're looking for the classic move tight end who's an oversized wide receiver who can win man to man with timing routes when he's elite. And there's three really, the unicorn, but we don't really look for the unicorn. We just be happy when they show up.
Right.
And then you have the oversized fullbacks who are Tucker Kraft and Ty Warren. They get dumped into open space because they're believable enough as run blockers that they get there, and JJ Watt goes, "How does it feel to catch a ball and nobody's within 15 yards of you in an
Right.
interview?" And that's
Yeah.
basically what I think's happening. And if more and more teams go to 12 personnel, then now we're valuing players not so much for their route running, but for their size, their strength, their ability to catch the ball, and their ability to block. And Sadiq at 241 and at 6'3" is likely maxed out at his weight,
Yeah.
give or take 5 to 7 pounds, maybe.
Yeah,
You know,
dude.
Yeah,
He looks like there's no. Well, he could gain a few pounds of fat. That's for sure. Because I don't think he has a single shred of fat on him. Kid's
yeah.
ripped. But
So can
but
he
yeah, I
beat?
think
Can
you're
he?
right.
Can he beat the wide receiver two on his team? That's
I
what's
don't
going to
think
be the
so.
big question. If he's
No.
better than an NFL wide receiver two, then you put him in.
Though
But
that's
he's not.
that's a Harold Fannin, Brock Bowers profile.
Yeah.
Like because Mike Gesicki is a slot wide receiver at the NFL level and a pretty good one, but not the best one.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he gets spotty play because it's like, well, sometimes you'll play, and when
Yeah.
you do, you're actually pretty fucking good. Against the right matchup, we can take advantage of what you're doing, but we can't play you all game because
Yeah. You're you're not
they'll
a
play you off the
matchup
field.
advantage.
No,
Yeah. You're
right?
yeah.
Yes, yeah,
I mean, James Casey out of Rice was that way. James
yeah,
Casey could play fullback, he could play wide receiver, he could play a move tight end, and he played for the Saints for a little bit, or for the Texans, actually, the Texans. And he had moments where you're like, "God, can we get him on the field?" But you've gotta be like Ozzie Newsome level in terms of what you're, who was an Alabama star receiver before he came to Cleveland.
yeah,
You need that to be
yeah.
that guy. And yeah, Sadiq's not going to be able to do that with most teams.
Not
So
unless he improves dramatically in a lot of route running stuff. Now, Stowers, on the other hand, has all that stuff, but he can't block me, you
right,
know?
right,
And so if he fails, so to speak, as a fantasy asset or even as an NFL asset, I think it'll be because he's not what we just talked about. He's not dynamic enough to be, Hayden Winks had a pretty cool little video. I disagreed with it, but that's okay. I think it was awesome. He said he should lose weight and be Mike Evans. I'm not so sure about that. I don't think he can just do that and all of a sudden be a meaningful wide receiver. That doesn't even make sense to me.
right.
But I understand what he's saying is that because he's so bad at blocking, he should probably just give it up and become a wide receiver. I would say that he doesn't need to be that great at blocking. He just needs to get better enough that the utility of him being on the field actually survives. And if he can't be on the field, he's going to have a hard time and he'll basically be, caught between a wide receiver and a tight end. And that where he could be the Mike Gesicki,
Yeah.
Stowers, right? He could sort of fall to that trap. I'm hopeful that he won't. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I look at him as this. The worst possible thing is that he's Harrison Bryant. Um,
Hmm.
and then I think the best possible thing is that he develops a blocking game and it becomes a guy that you can say, oh, he's kind of in like he's down the block from Trey McBride, but
Yeah.
the neighborhood value is a little bit less.
Yeah.
And he's
High crime area, Trey McBride.
well,
Right.
I would say Isaiah Likely, yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
then or just like Walmart's near there. You got the
Yeah. Yeah.
Walmart basically got built right across the street. Whereas
Yeah.
like Isaiah Likely, we might see some value from him this year as people promised, but I think he can be better than Isaiah Likely,
Yeah.
which is a lot of people love Isaiah Likely. But it again depends on the fit. This is a very fit oriented class, and
Yeah.
even then, I think the upside for most of these players isn't 1,000 yards. It's
Mm-mm.
more like 500 to 800 yards is
Agree.
probably, and 800's pushing it for a lot of these guys. And it just depends. There's a few guys in here that I look at and I go, okay, like one of my favorite tight ends in this class is Carson Ryan out of BYU, and nobody has him high. Um, but I think he's actually pound for pound the best blocker in this class, and
Right.
he's 250, and he's a much better receiver than people give him credit for. He's like Jake Ferguson. But see, Jake Ferguson, when you think of him, is you go, oh, well, one of their tight end prospects got hurt. They put Jake in, or they put Schultz got hurt. Jake came in. They didn't anticipate him being as good as he was. And now you can't get him off the field because he's a security blanket for Dak Prescott. And he's really skilled at a lot of different things. Carson Ryan's that type of player. But the rest of these guys, there's a little more boom bust in that, or where do they go? How many of these teams are going to start adapting to what the Rams have done, what the Lions and the Ravens have done? Are there any teams that are switching back to 11 personnel? I doubt it. I think they're more and more are going towards 12 and 13, and suddenly we might be looking at this and going, "Oh, we valued these move tight ends too high this year." It's very possible that that could be an outcome.
Carson Ryan, was he not invited to the
No,
combine, huh?
no, and he's my guy. He's my plant a flag guy late where I
Hmm.
go, he's my fifth tight end on my board.
Yeah.
And it's hilarious because he played at UCLA, Utah, and BYU.
Yep.
And everywhere he went, I've literally watched plays where quarterbacks throw him open like he's Lad McConkey downfield. And you're just like, I literally watched guys, and there were, at least as you can see, there were 20 other guys probably at the combine that I went, they did not deserve to be there ahead of Carson Ryan. Carson Ryan is really good, and I'm especially as kind of a zone player
Yeah,
who can do a lot as a blocker. I mean, I've
interesting.
watched him block some of them. I watched him block the Miami D's, um, you know, this year, and he handled himself well. His angles that he takes are fantastic. Like, he's a
Nice.
very smart player. So yeah,
Interesting. Well, that's crazy because it was a record number of invitees at tight end position, which I think speaks to the fact that you and I think there's some depth here for sure, right?
yep. There's
Yep.
definitely depth. Yeah,
Yeah, depth at the tight end position. I've sort of advised that, and I'll say it again based off of what Matt Waldman is saying that late in this draft, we're not taking wide receivers. We're taking normally running backs, but in this case, I'm sprinkling a few tight ends as well. Matt, we don't have much time left, and that is upsetting. But we get to create as much time as we want, so we'll see how that goes. But I want to get to the wide receivers. This is where the red meat is. This is where I think the cream of the crop of the class is. And you have Carnell Tate as your wide receiver one. I have to ask, you did not have Marvin Harrison Jr. rated quite as high. Do you think that Carnell Tate straight up is a better prospect than was Marvin Harrison Jr.?
yeah. 14 days out, 14 times out of 7, I would say it,
Hmm.
out of a week, because first of all, Marvin Harrison was a linear route runner, more of a linear mover, not very good, not great with his bends, not great with cutting back to the quarterback on like curl routes or dig routes. That's not, wasn't fantastic at that. He gets himself pinned to the sideline too often. When I watched him in college, and on top of that, the biggest concern I had was his hands. He could make great catches with his back to the ball, but when he had to face the ball and it was in a contested situation, he did not use the correct technique. His hands were too far apart. He used underhand position to catch balls he should be catching with overhand. He waited until the ball was almost behind him on a lot of plays that he could have caught at the earliest point, and it's come back to bite him in the backside the first 2 years in the league, because basically he learned how to. I mean, I don't know this for sure, but I would guess that he learned how to catch the football from his all-time great dad, who catches the ball like a 1970s wide receiver, and he's one of the 4 exceptions I've studied in 21 years who could catch the ball with poor technique and get away with it and it not be a problem. And Harrison Sr. has that problem. Carnell Tate has peerless hand technique. I mean, like, his ability, that's tough to catch a ball with your hands together the way you want it to be, or like this, depending on how it's coached. But you want your hands together at the catch point, and when you attack a ball above your head or high and away, you want your hands in that position. Carnell Tate's hands are always together, almost always together when I see that, and that's rare. I don't see that with a lot of wide receivers in the NFL. That those two areas of targets are the most difficult to do that with. He and Makai Lemon both do that well. He is a strong route runner. He understands patience but suddenness in terms of how you execute the footwork techniques that you want to use off the line of scrimmage to get separation. He understands different stem movements and stem strategies to force defenders off their spots and manipulate them heading into the break, so that they end up moving in the wrong direction because of the way he uses his stems. So he sets defenders up well. His breaks are good with small lapses here and there, but you've seen enough from him to know that they're just lapses. And people talk him as mainly a vertical receiver, but he's actually a guy who can run breaks inside. He's a guy that who can break on curls and come back to the quarterback. And then they say, well, the yards after the catch isn't all that great. Well, he's not Torrey Holt, okay? He's not falling down and just avoiding running after the catch. And he also, Jeremiah Love's the guy that clears out the field more often at times on some of the deep stuff. And while Tate got his share of deep shots, he also was used in the screen game, or he's used on routes where he was catching the ball in traffic. He's not Steve Smith, senior, but he's certainly a guy that can give you some yards, make a man miss, break a tackle, and give you something. So overall, to me, this is a player who maybe he's not Justin Jefferson, but I think that he is close to that tier of player and will be an instant starter. And there's very little about him that I would completely nitpick. And then the 40 time, I mean, well, listen, we've heard
Yeah,
enough about that and talked about that. He's a very good receiver who, unless he's on a team with unless he's on the Bengals or the Vikings or or the Eagles with AJ Brown still there, or a team like or the Rams. That's the only reasons he's probably not starting right away and
yeah.
likely the best receiver on the team.
Okay, so I can understand this, right? So a lot of the data that we look at when we see Carnell Tate is like, okay, the contested catch percentage like is incredible. He was like 12 of 14 this past season, according to PFF numbers. So going up and getting it in traffic situations, he comes down with it. Quarterback rating when targeted was almost perfect. It was like 150 this year. Like basically every ball that was thrown his way was successful in a big bad way this year. Unbelievable. His junior year was really dope. 3 yards per route run, all playing alongside Jeremiah Smith. I can give you all of these, positives about the way that he plays, and he's going to be drafted in the first round. He'll be the first wide receiver taken. The 4.3 is actually good. The fact that people would even think that's a problem is like also laughable to me. So that's not even a negative. Matt, you'll be happy to know that in the OTC wide receiver model, there is zero size or athleticism in it because that is accounted for moreover in draft capital when it finally hits. Yeah, I mean my nitpicks with him are basically the target earning that he did not do throughout his career. He was basically has a 19.5% target rate as a career player. A lot of people will then say, "Yeah, but," and they'll fire off the Ohio State, teammates. And I
Alumni,
said,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I said, well, so they also had the same teammates and they had a better target rate than him. So that's what I'm saying. His target rate is somewhat problematic. Look, if he didn't have those teammates, it would be disqualifying. I guess what I'm saying is he maybe more pigeonholed at the NFL level as an outside sort of player, a la Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze, who were both great outside players, but didn't necessarily get there for us in fantasy? Or do you see him being deployed as sort of an all-purpose weapon in the slot all over the place?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that you look at him and this as a senior, and you realize that well, the all-purpose slot, you know, the all-purpose slot flanker type was probably JSN, and then a few years before that, you had Olave and Garrett Wilson when he was a freshman, probably right. So you're looking at players on that guard, and then there was the Marvin Harrison. Oh, he's the greatest thing since sliced bread, type of thing. It is possible that when you have that many players and you get anointed that way, that you can get lost in the shuffle, even though you're very good.
Yeah.
Now again, we're talking about the exception to the rule, though, and
Yep.
that's the thing. So if you're looking more from an analytical standpoint about about target rate, then you might look at it and go, well, we need to see proof of concept before we get on board with that, and I can
Right.
understand that. And there is a possibility that he becomes a better NFL wide receiver than a fantasy wide receiver. That could happen.
Yep.
I'm less inclined to see that just because when I watch how he's targeted, how he runs routes, what translates to a variety of spots, I think that he just happens to be like Justin Jefferson in this regard. Um, at LSU, you had Jamar Chase, who was basically what everyone thought Marvin Harrison was times two. And then you had Terrace Marshall, who everybody thought was the best receiver that was going to come out of the three. They're like, oh, he's the one with the highest
Yeah.
ceiling. We're
Yeah.
worried about Jamar Chase dropping the ball, and he took a year off. You know, and then there's Justin Jefferson, who was kind of this guy that everybody was like, he's like he's the gritty slot receiver who plays special teams,
Mhm.
who's he makes some tough catches, and
That
he's
that was the that
fun.
that that was the last time the NFL intelligentsia made the "he's only a slot player" mistake, and assume they might be making it again this year, but please continue.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that that's kind of the deal with him, is that there were so many other players that, and you look at Jeremiah Smith, and because he's the fastest guy, of course
Yeah,
he's going to get that love. Because Marvin Smith was the biggest guy and came from NFL royalty, is probably getting the
yeah,
most hype. JSN was the most versatile player and the best route runner of that group. I would argue Olave was better than Garrett Wilson,
yeah,
by a little bit, but both those guys were phenoms too.
they
So
were,
you just kind of, sometimes there's a point where you look at those guys that they kind of get lost in the shuffle
for
after a
sure.
while. And I think that Carnell Tate was one of those guys that get lost in the shuffle, and you go, wait a minute, this guy's really good.
Yeah, yeah.
But he
That's
doesn't
that
have
makes
one thing to
sense.
stand on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense because, I mean, in his final season, he was just so good that, I mean, yeah, it was pretty impressive how effective he was on a per target basis. I question a little bit how effective he was on a per route basis, which, I know people will be like, God, this guy's splitting hairs. Well, yeah, that's what we do. We have
Yeah,
to
sure.
figure out, because you turn around and you go, oh yeah, this guy sucked. Not to say that Carnell Tate will
Yeah.
suck, but after you turn around and go, we should have seen that coming. He didn't even earn targets at the college level. No wonder he's only and here's the thing. It's like, do I think that guy sucks? No. Like Jamison Williams, very much that type of prospect. So, I'm not saying that Jamison Williams is the same as Carnell Tate in terms of how good they are at things. You would
Right.
be better to answer that.
Right.
What I'm saying is that analytically, Jamison Williams was a low uh, target guy who made big plays all day fucking long because he's awesome,
Yeah.
right? But he still has had a hard time seeing the targets at the NFL level, and that's been the issue. Now, he's had 2 straight years, Jamison Williams, that is, of making enough big plays in an awesome offense where it hasn't really mattered. Although a couple goose eggs had some people shaken early in the year rostering Jamison. Long story short is I wonder if Carnell Tate is a little closer to that than people would like to admit. Is that possible?
I mean, it's possible. I don't know if it's probable, but I think it's possible. And I mean, like, just to kind of circle back to the argument I was making, like, if you look at, like, oh, let's talk about running backs. Okay. From the University of Miami, one of the places I matriculated through way back in the day. There's two running back. I went to running back schools. I think that's how I chose my schools, was University of Miami and
Edge and
then Georgia.
Portis, yeah,
But like, think about it. You had Willis McGahee,
McGahee,
then you had Najee Davenport as like a part-time player alongside Edgerrin James.
Edge,
Then you had Clinton Portis, and then you also had
Duke
Frank
Johnson,
Gore, Duke Johnson, but you had like one
Frank
after the
Gore,
other.
yeah,
You had um you had like Edge, McGahee, Portis, and Gore. And
yes,
Gore was the two ACL tear guy who was playing hurt, and he had one good season, while moments in other seasons, but kept getting hurt, so you didn't really know what you had in him.
yeah,
And but what most people didn't realize is Frank Gore was basically the NFL's version of Achilles.
yes,
He was just held together by the backs of his knees when they dipped him in the river Styx. But
unbelievable.
yeah, he was literally teaching tape for years, and still is, on how to run pretty much every scheme by running back
Yeah,
coaches.
right.
He's but if you heard the legend with him, it's kind of like he's almost like the natural, like Bernard Malamute's the natural, because coming out of school, um, it was Larry Coker. He
Yeah,
recruited with Jimmy Johnson and was a running back coach at Oklahoma State when they had Barry Sanders and Thurman Thomas, who, yeah, unbelievable. And he said Frank Gore is the best high school running back he ever watched and studied and recruited, and that includes Barry Sanders.
mhm,
And when you watch Frank Gore when he had his two ACLs intact, he had a level of movement that was it wasn't crazy like Barry,
no,
but
but
but the speed and gliding, acceleration, and with his size and the cutting ability, you're just like, there was an ooh, when you watch that guy play.
Yeah. He was once young, and people remember Frank Gore as the old, puffy sort of, "How the hell is he still
Yeah,
hanging on?" Frank Gore, but,
but
yeah, if you
but he
rewind far enough,
yeah.
he was an explosive, electric college football player.
Yeah, and that's what's hilarious is that he came to the league as an old player via his
Yeah.
knees. He should,
Right.
it was like,
That's
he
right.
was limping through his senior
Yeah.
year, trying to work through that. But like freshman Frank Gore, if he had freshman legs, Frank Gore would not be like whatever. Frank Gore would break every record that happened in the NFL. He
Yeah,
was
he was
that
pretty dope.
smart of a runner.
Yeah.
So yeah, so when I see that, you see guys get lost in the mix like that when you have running back use like that. I mean, even
Yeah.
Terrell Davis got lost in the mix because
Yeah.
they had Garrison Hurst, Rodney Hampton, and I remember he joined that team, and I was covering that team in college, and Ray Goff was the coach, and Ray Goff wouldn't let scouts even look at his tape because he thought he thought Terrell Davis was like hamming it up with injury and not really as hurt as he was and didn't think he was as tough and basically punished him. But when you watched him play, like there were times you get on the field, and I remember watching him, and I was not even scouting players at that time, but I've watched Garrison Hurst and I'd watch Terrell Davis. And I go, Terrell Davis is pretty dang good. Like
Yeah.
he's really good. What is going on here? But like, and then like the players, they'd all look at Garrison Hurst and he'd be late for interviews and they'd all shake their head and go, he's a great player, but
He ain't
and
gonna be it.
it took a lesson. It took some lessons and Hurst was very good, but Hurst needed to mature and he did
Yeah.
eventually. But TD was a phenom.
He sure was. He won John Elway 2 Super Bowls when, poor Elway. I watched the Elway thing on Netflix. Did you see this?
Yes, yes,
It was pretty good. I
it
enjoyed it.
was.
And, I don't know about you, but every time I'm watching something like that, I kinda want 'em to spend a little bit more time on setting up the football stuff, like, when there's a game, like,
Yeah,
they're going to the Super Bowl or the playoffs, I'm like, "Alright, just give me a little bit more of the football." And then
yeah,
they'll be like, "Yada, yada, yada, they won the Super Bowl." You're like, okay, it's fine. I know it's a show for the masses, but I really was
yeah.
hoping for a little bit more, anyway, I'm a nerd.
It gave me
Um,
sympathy for a player that, back in the day, would have. I told my buddy Cecil Lammy, who is a beat writer for Denver. We saw him in a Starbucks during the Senior Bowl, and I got up after he said hello to everybody and got in line. But before I got in line, I looked at Cecil. I said, "Do you have about $5,000 or $6,000 available?" He's like, "No." I said, "Well, I need bail money because I'm on behalf of all Cleveland Browns everywhere. I'm gonna sack that motherfucker right here in the Starbucks just for somebody." And he had a good laugh. So
yes,
yeah.
yes, yes. Well, God bless the Cleveland Browns. I mean, that they're going to get Carnell Tate, and that's going to be rough.
Yes.
Well, we see this opposite because your wide receiver one is my wide receiver two. My wide receiver two is your wide receiver one. So what a stark difference. No, I'm only joking. In other words, it sounds to me, I love Mekhi Lemon, and the only reason that I have him as wide receiver one is not because I think he'll be drafted first in the NFL draft, not because I think he's a quote unquote better wide receiver than Carnell Tate, but because he does work out of the slot. And then if he's drafted in the first round, see the difference between, see, a lot of people say slot only. And I would say that guys drafted in the first round, like JSN, who are slot only, aren't going to be slot only, or they're actually a bust if they end up being just slot only. That's a bust because Seattle doesn't want just a slot player. They wanted a guy who could do everything that JSN is doing right now, which is when there are three wide receivers or whatever, he's the queen chess piece. He just moves to wherever the mismatch is, wherever it's best to have him. They did such an outstanding job with that. I mean, the JSN season, we didn't even really see that coming this year, especially given the system that they ran in Seattle with only a couple of wide receivers on the field. Unbelievable. All that to say that sort of prototype, that Justin Jefferson was one of them, coming from the slot in college. CeeDee Lamb played mostly, almost primarily slot in his rookie season. Amon Ra plays slot. Cooper Kupp triple crown through the slot. Slot becomes a dirty word, um, because I think it's fairly replaceable at the sort of average level in the NFL, right? In other words, it's easy to find a guy who can just kind of do that stuff, but yet it's still so lucrative. Like, in other words, if you have a Wandale Robinson, he's more valuable than whoever the equivalent to Dubs. Dubs and Wandale, right? Dubs plays on the outside. Wandale was more valuable as sort of his own little guy than Dubs was as a primary outside player who's not an elite. I guess what I'm getting at is if Mekhi Lemon's taking that first round, he's going to be not only slot but also Z or flanker when it's time to be in two wide receiver. He's going to play plenty, and I just love the profile. I love how tough he is. Tell me I'm crazy.
No, not at all. Because he's, he's my second rated player and he's
Yeah.
very close to being a franchise caliber player on my board. The difference
Mm,
is that I'm scoring. This is where the football part comes in. And what
bingo.
I alluded to earlier is that and I've told people this literally in my scouting report that you would read is that Kyle Lemon could easily be the number one guy off the board post draft because
Right.
if he lands on a team that actually features him more as a slot. Now, this is where I would disagree with a little bit about some things. If they feature him more as a slot or they move him around a lot and they have more area to move him around a lot and more of a spread look,
Yeah.
um, then I think that he with a good landing spot could wind up that way because I think
Yeah.
his route running from like the stem to the break to the setups are good enough that he's he's close to Carnell Tate's level as a route runner. Um, and so I would say that Tate has a little more upside than Lemon does because I don't see Lemon with the ability. He hasn't shown the ability to bend and create at the level that I want to see Tate do for timing routes. And then the other part about that is that Lemon's a tier below Tate with releases. His releases aren't very strong. So when we're looking from a broader standpoint of like can they play multiple positions? Can they play at the outside at a high level against top level cornerbacks? Are you going to use him, at all three positions? Well, I would say Lemon has two,
Yeah.
but at the same time, which one do I think he's stronger at? And I'd say
Yeah.
he's
Slot.
stronger at slot. As a
Yeah.
flanker, though, the nice thing about being a flanker is you're playing off the line of scrimmage, so
Right.
you're not getting jammed as easily as you are as a split end.
Next. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so if he lands on a team that's more of a three tight end type of look, and they make him play flanker more often, well, I just think there's more that Tate offers. But if you're
Yeah.
gonna, but the team that's gonna pick him would be fucking
Knows that. Right.
crazy
Right.
to take him as
Right.
a
Yeah.
slot. But
That's
I
kind of
have
my point.
yes,
That's kind of my point.
yeah,
Is like if you're a fifth round pick or even a third round pick, we're not
yeah,
changing. You're just on the team, man. You
yeah,
know what I mean?
yeah,
But if you're picking the first round, you're
yeah,
kind of important part. We're planning some shit with you. We got
yeah.
plans.
I just
We draft you with a plan. If you don't, you're right. It would have to be the
yeah.
the
But
dumbest
I
thing
have
ever.
to make room for stupid. So that's
Correct.
kind of the where I'm
Yeah.
at is
Correct.
like I have to make room for stupid because
Yep.
there's certain things you project and certain things you say you have to prove it to me or it
Yeah.
has to be
No
proven.
doubt.
So like because otherwise I'm like now giving him point values for releases that he doesn't have because I want to say that he's number 1 because of the team he goes to. But in the post draft, like I
Yeah.
said, the post draft when he gets drafted, I look at the setup and I go, okay, he's got the most appealing situation. I'll put him 1. I'll put Tate 2 or 3 or whatever.
But I would even say JSN and obviously Amon Ra and some of the I mean, even CeeDee Lamb went behind Henry Ruggs. So if we go back in time, we can see that the NFL was valuing the sort of the speed over Lamb, and
Yeah, I'm not.
JSN went,
Yeah,
the
please.
20th pick. Go ahead.
Yeah, just don't associate me with the NFL on that level because CeeDee Lamb to me was a fucking stud,
Me
who
too.
could do
Yeah.
everything. But like, I know
Yes.
what you're saying. You're right. Like the
Yeah.
the one dimensional guys, um, I it's very hard for my system to score a guy higher than everybody else, you can only run verts.
Even Jefferson went behind Rager and was like the 22nd pick of the draft. Now I know
Yeah,
that that seems silly in hindsight, but trust me, it wasn't at that moment.
yeah.
I mean, for Minnesota, it was. They were
AJ
super
Brown
excited.
was
Yep,
just a slot receiver. That's all he
yep,
was,
yep,
and he and Jefferson were my two highest guys in the RSP post draft because I was like, oh,
yeah,
the landing spot's great. And people are like, what are you talking about? I'm like, nah, you got to study these teams. You got to understand.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, there you go. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I think there's a little anti-slot bias by the NFL in general. So, any first round guy who's slot only is probably going to be pretty good. And I think if Mekhi Lemon gets that first round capital, top 20 picks or something, I am going to be all in. Yeah, you'd like to see it also be with a team that knows what the hell they're doing with a little bit of pace and a little bit of offense, but beggars can't be choosers. You know, if they're that bad, they'll all be replaced in a year
yeah,
and we'll have something else new. Um, Here's the way I want to ask this question because I'm kind of curious how you see the rest of the class because I heard you already and I think you've basically said this is the clear one, clear two.
right.
And kind of I can get with this because I'm starting to have some questions. I'm not so sure. So I guess I would ask this. After that, how do you like if they were 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? Like not take the names out of it. Is there a cluster of sorts? How do you have this in general? How do you see this?
Yeah, I have one, I have two, and then I would say um, three through three through five are one tier, and then
Okay.
or they're the top of one tier,
Yep.
and then I would say six through six, yeah, maybe three through six are a second tier. That's what I have is
Yep.
three through six is second tier, and then there's a big tier three, which is from seven through. Here we go. Keep scrolling, my man. Seven through. There we go. It can't be that. Yep, it's that big. 7 through 38. But
Yeah.
it's a bigger. It's a more gradual
Sure,
decline
sure, sure.
from where that is. So
But
tier three.
so like if we're you and
Yeah.
I running an NFL team, let's just say, and we're sort of targeting maybe the top 6, 7, 8, maybe is that kind of where
Yep.
we're looking to say, hey, after that, there starts to become a little bit of a difference.
Yeah, I would say you're probably looking at your first. I would say your first 14 is probably where I'd feel comfortable.
Yep.
And you're drafting, probably the first six within before late day three.
Yeah.
Like fourth round and up, you're probably
Yep.
looking at the top six, and then 7 through 14 is probably guys you'd be picking in the fourth to fifth round, and then after that is sixth round and below.
Do you have first round and second round grades, things like that on them? Is that
I don't really do
that's
that, but
okay.
I'm
Yeah.
approximating it. Yeah.
Me neither. That's why I was just going to ask. I mean, what I do try to do as a dynasty drafter and as a dynasty analyst, and what I'm telling people all the time. This comes from Scott Connor. Everything is stolen anyway, so don't worry about it. But he had mentioned, and I have adopted really trying to look at not drafting wide receivers taken after picks 40 or 50, or even if you want to stretch it, second round. Like don't draft third, fourth, fifth round wide receivers in your dynasty drafts just because they're probably not going to be that good. You know what I mean? And you're better off moving past those players and drafting running backs of the same ilk. And that's probably true, that
I
you get
can see
more
that.
from the running back position at that particular point in the draft than you do from those wide receivers. There's some really pretty names in those wide receivers, but generally speaking, they're going to burn you. Long story short. So anyway, I try to see where about that is, and I think I'm trying to just work that with you a little bit before I sort of ask you player specific. So I'm dying to know because I've got some players I really like. Can you just share with me your 3 through 6?
Sure. I have no problem with
Yeah.
that. The one that is probably the most controversial is number three. It's Malachi Fields at Notre Dame,
Mm,
who I think that the route running is close to him becoming a strong route runner with timing routes. He's very good at positioning for the ball. The speed isn't great, but the acceleration and short area quickness show up on the field very well in terms of making people miss, in terms of what you apply to timing routes. The hands are strong. He's good in zone. Former quarterback. So I think that do I think that I think he could be a very good wide receiver too. That's how I would put him. Maybe
Yeah.
a low end wide receiver one, but most likely better as a two. Casey Concepcion, big fan of what he does for the most part.
Yeah.
I think he's a better version of Khalil Shakir, though
Yeah.
I really like Khalil Shakir, and I think the Bills kind of limit him. But Concepcion is more on the high end of coming back down, whereas Khalil Shakir is on the low end trying to work his way up in terms of how perception is.
Yeah.
Concepcion is a clap attacker with certain types of targets.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's okay because the targets where he tends to see his technique suffer is the targets where everybody's technique tends to suffer, which is high targets and targets high and away. That's where he tends to clap on them. But if you see that when he has to make contested catches with targets that are not pinpoint, he has a very high rate from my sample of 8 games that I've watched where he's done a good job of that. He can make acrobatic plays. He's a very good route runner. He's got skill as a running back in terms of working in traffic. They used him in that capacity situationally at NC State. You could see the vision, the movement, the footwork that shows up well both in space, in traffic, and as a route runner. So I see him as a slot receiver who can also play flanker and eventually get there. Whether you want to say he's kind of a somewhere between, as Matt Harmon said today when we were on a show earlier, Jaden Reed and Stephon Diggs, he's somewhere between
Yeah.
that. I would, I went a little older school and thought Steve Smith the second, the former Giants receiver who had I think a 1,200 yard receive, 100 catch, like 1,200 yard season with Eli before his knees basically betrayed him. He was a absolute monster at uh, at USC and could kind of do a little bit of everything. So Concepcion's that player. Skylar Bell is my wide receiver
Mm.
5. That's a spicy take apparently for a lot of
I like
people,
Skylar Bell.
but
Yeah.
I think that people are losing their mind. I laughed today on X because I saw this morning that I think Dave Hellman of the Athletic, I think that's who he's with, um, gave him a Jamar Chase comp
Yeah. Yeah.
stylistically, and
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
were like, "Oh my god, that's awful!" And somebody was talking about how bad that was, and brought up my name and roped me into the conversation,
Oh no.
but by saying, like Matt, I like how Matt uses. He followed up by saying, "I like how Matt Waldman uses spectrums of players with that."
Sure.
Well, at the top of my spectrum for Skylar Bell is Jamar Chase.
Right.
Now, I don't think he's ever going to reach that spectrum. He's more like Lavernius Coles, which I think
Yeah.
is still a Pro Bowl caliber receiver who's tough, who's physical, who can catch the ball. Now, Bell's a weird exception for me that I'm taking a chance on because, um, like I talked to you guys, what I said earlier about clap attacking, being a serial clap attacker, there are only 4 receivers that I've seen in over 20 years who who've given you even contributor level production who clap attack so much. And the thing is, when I studied those 4 receivers, what were the commonalities, and were there commonalities with Skylar Bell? And on film, there were commonalities. It's that um, half of those guys I mentioned could catch with proper technique. They just were very good at catching with clap attacking and just happened to be good. A lot of the clap attackers who fail, it's because they try to use the right technique and they can't do it, and they're just forced to go back to this really inefficient way of catching from 1977. And that's but Skylar Bell can use the right technique. But he just is so good at using the other that he makes strong catches. He only has 4 drops in his career, I believe, or
Yeah.
4 drops last year. He makes incredibly good catches. He's got strong tracking technique, and his movement skills are almost extraordinary. I would say that
That's true.
I've watched him make a curvilinear move against Boston College after I had already graded him and hadn't seen him do this before, and it was like a Barry Sanders esque type move in terms of how you bend around a defense that he should not have been able to do what I saw him do. And he has a lot of plays like that. So those are my 3 through 6. Is that what you're looking for? or
Yeah,
longer?
absolutely.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, he did have more
Oh,
drops earlier in his career, but certainly was not
yeah,
a drop guy later in his career. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
yeah. And
That
then
being
Jordan
said,
Tyson is 6. Yeah.
that was the next guy. So Jordan Tyson was kind of missing until he wasn't. He's in this spot. You know, ironically, our OTC wide receiver model, surprising to me, did not like Jordan Tyson as much as my general perspective did. I just thought I was going to, really come out liking him. There's been some fade here on Jordan Tyson. If you're on Twitter, you see some people really, starting to pile on with Jordan Tyson on the negative. I don't know what to make of Jordan Tyson. I'm really in the camp of I have no idea what to think here. Tell me a little bit about at least what I should be hopeful for and careful of.
You're in good company. Matt Harmon and I said about the same thing a few hours ago because we were talking about this. Is that Tyson's Tyson could very easily be the wide receiver one in this class when it's all said and
Right.
done if he can stay healthy and he can improve all the small details of his game that are loose ends that are untied. Um, but because there's enough of him, it's again a death by a thousand paper cuts that he's not a franchise caliber scored player. He's just below immediate starter level for me. He's a high end contributor. Like he's a half a point away from having that baseline to be an immediate starter talent. And it's because there's something wrong with just about every route that he runs
Right.
from every almost every rep. And occasionally you get these excellent routes that people are like, oh my God, they're great.
Whoa.
And there are
Yeah.
these moments as a ball carrier that you like, But the problem is that it's not consistent enough. Most of his
Yeah.
routes, there's something missing either with how he executes a release, how he executes a break, that he's not nuanced enough at the mid stem, top of his stem to set up a defender.
He's like
Drop
a talented
passes.
he's like a talented freelancer, right?
Yes, yes. Like
Right? You're like he's like, "Whoa, look at me." But yeah, it like works cuz he's really
yeah,
talented,
yeah.
you
Like
know?
he's like I've said this. I think it's a good way to put it. I compared the top of my comparison spectrum is Chris Godwin. I as a film watcher, Chris Godwin to me is one of the most underrated receivers of
He's
this
pretty dope.
era because he can play if Mike Evans weren't there and when he's healthy, he can do almost everything Mike Evans can do in his 6'2" frame. He is
Yep.
he
He's
is
really good.
he is really good. He's the joke is that my friends who watch football and we talk ball and I talk about Chris Godwin, like I have reverence for him.
That's why
Um,
when you said I was like, "Excuse me, sir, did you
yeah,
just say Chris
yeah,
Godwin?"
but
Like,
imagine yeah,
yeah,
imagine if Chris Godwin had a son, and his son was, like, uber talented,
but
um,
entitled.
but yeah, a little entitled, like a good kid, but doesn't
Yeah,
know that he's a little
right.
more privileged than
Yeah, you're
he
like,
is,
"Bro,
you
fucking
know?
listen for a minute."
Yeah,
He's like, "I got this."
yeah, exactly. Like, "Dad, come
Yeah.
on, I'm doing well." And, like, he's too good of a kid that you can't, like, be ticked off at him or else
Right,
you're
right.
you're that stage parent. Now you're a stage
Yeah,
parent if you act the
yeah,
way that you need to do, but you kinda go, "God, I would just like him to work a little bit more." Like,
yep,
he's too good of a student, he's having a fun life, he's got other interests, and and I love him for all of that, but he says he really wants to be an NFL player, and I'm trying to tell him, dude, you're going to have to do more. You're just
yeah,
going to have to do more with that. And he's not.
yep.
And that's kind of where Jordan Tyson is as a football player is that he's that very talented, entitled kid. And he may not be entitled in real life
No, 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 yeah,
at
I
all.
mean,
Let's make sure,
figuratively,
yeah.
right,
But
yeah,
figuratively, he seems like that entitled kid where you're going, God, just you have
yes.
more talent than I do, but
His
like
his
you're not
his
going to
route
make it.
his route running is entitled.
Yes, it
Yes, it's what
is.
we're talking about. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's the
Not him
injuries.
as a human.
It's just
Yeah,
the injuries are the big
yeah,
question too because he would be a starter easily if it weren't for the injuries
yeah,
for me, but it's like, he's still dealing with the hamstring, which tells you can he stay healthy because of the more serious injuries that he's had and when you ask him to do things that he's shown he can do in moments Does that get him banged up because his body's not quite prepared to handle the load that he needs to have? There's some real questions there that may get answered quickly, and we go, "No, we overthought it." But,
Yeah.
but they're legitimate questions.
Okay, you left off my guy, so we've got problems. But before we get to my guy, I'm just going to ask you, like, Malachi Fields versus Denzel Boston. I have a hard time telling myself that I prefer Malachi Fields. Tell me why no Denzel Boston yet?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is the one that in my commentary for Denzel Boston,
And you might
who
be
is
right, by the way.
no,
Yeah, I
no,
mean,
well,
yeah, yeah,
you'll get the answer real quick, and you'll
yeah,
realize that you'll feel a lot better about this, okay? As an evaluator, I cannot give credit to things that I have not seen. Okay. So
yeah.
you've got to prove it. Even if I think they probably could do it, even if 99% likely they can do it, I
They've never
can't
done it.
give them the
Right,
credit.
right.
So this is one of those cases with Denzel Boston. Denzel Boston is ranked, this is why rankings suck. He's wide receiver 14 on my board. Okay.
Okay,
It sounds awful,
right.
compared to where he's at. But the score is close enough that if two things were different, he would be like wide receiver 6 or wide receiver 7 at worst,
Sure.
maybe even wide receiver 5. Okay.
Okay,
And I wrote in my commentary, I'll read it to you because you'll see what it basically is. If you rank him wide receiver 5, I'll have no argument. He's a safe outside receiver with a high floor and high ceiling in a tier with wide receivers with lower floors but elite ceilings. Okay. So, what that means, how that translates to get into detail, is that when you look at his releases and separation skills, his routes and his receiving, and his elusiveness and ball handling and even balance, they're all on the same tier as the top 5 receivers, pretty much, or close. All right. The two areas where he got marked down is in vision and in durability. And the only reason is that my criteria for vision, I didn't see enough plays, even as I looked hard, to score him for a higher level of vision because he just wasn't used that way.
sure.
So instead of getting an extra point or two, he was below average, and I know he's probably not below average, but
Right.
there are 2 point I couldn't score it. So he's at 2, and then, like, for his durability, I had to be marked off because he had an injury that required some rehab and missed a certain number of games, where I'm like, probably will be fine.
Right.
So at worst, let's say I'm charitable and say, I wouldn't even call it charitable. Let's say that I just fudged how I do it and say durability, come on, he's going to stay healthy. It's not a big deal. Let's give him an extra 0.8 points. If I did that, he would move up. He would be he would probably be wide receiver 8 just on that alone.
Yeah.
Okay. And then if I gave him an extra point, he would be above Jordan Tyson and close to Skylar Bell. And my thing is probably tied at wide receiver 5 effectively. And if
Got
I
it.
gave him an extra point above that, he would be wide receiver 4. So
Yeah.
yeah, and that's why
It's a
yeah,
thin tier for you then. I
yeah,
appreciate that then. And then so Denzel Boston, I expected there's a lot of you'll appreciate this one, knowing that there's the what we think and then what the real is. There's a lot of contested catches on his highlight film. In other words, people will say, "Oh, Denzel Boston, a contested catch guy," meaning that, oh, he must have had a lot of contested targets. And while the volume of contested targets, I guess, were somewhat high, I guess, I mean, just because he had a lot of targets, because his contested target percentage is not one of the lowest, but it's certainly well below average and below a lot of players.
right.
Below Omar Cooper, below Malachi Fields, below Chris Bell, below Elijah Surratt, below Chris Brazel, below Jacoby Lane, below Ted Hurst, below Antonio Williams, for crying out loud, below, all these guys, right? Below Carnell Tate. So like he only has 17.5% of his targets were contested, but he did come down with 61% of those, which is basically the best in the class. I mean, not obviously behind Carnell Tate And let me see if there's anybody else. I mean, yeah, you have to go way down to like CJ Daniels or whatever. Basically, he's the best of the, one of the best at converting, even though he did not have a ton of them. So I think there's probably a little bit of a false narrative around him that he's not open in every target he gets tested. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, I charted, let's see how many games of his I chart. 7 games of his I charted, and I chart it by pinpoint targets that, to me, those are passes that are thrown according to the route and the coverage, and that the receivers getting the ball on, making adjustments that he should make for based on the route and coverage, and that's pinpoint, or is right on him
Yeah,
if that's the type of route. A general catch is one where it's not thrown where it should be and they had to make an adjustment, but it's reasonable. And a difficult catch is one where you shouldn't expect him to catch it. If he drops that pass, you don't count that as a drop. Okay.
right, right, right.
And it means an extreme extension, getting a hospital ball thrown at him. Actually, I'd
Yeah,
probably call it a coffin ball,
yeah,
and some of those that happen, that kind of thing. Derek Carr throwing to Chris Olave,
hmm,
and Mike Thomas. But I saw, he had a 71% rate, no, an 80% rate against pinpoint against contact. He had of the sample I saw, he had a 100% rate of having to make adjustments on a less than pinpoint accurate ball against contact, 78% against tight coverage, where it was just like glued to
yeah,
him. So I like that. And then when you look at his separation, the things that I saw was that he he has some skills in terms of how to use his feet, and he has the tools and how to do that, and has a good bit of them overall. I think that he can be a little too deliberate at times and get pinned to the boundary, but it's because he needs to do a little bit more with patience and suddenness. Most receivers who enter the league don't have that Devontae Adams patience suddenness thing down, unless you're Malik Neighbors, or even like some of what I saw with even Luther Burden could do some of that, but
yeah.
they don't, it's not the norm. And I'd say
Those
for
guys are
Boston,
rare.
yeah, for Boston it's not the
Burden and
norm.
Neighbors is rare.
Yeah,
Those two
exactly.
guys. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
But separation wise, he can win against cornerbacks off the
yeah.
line, and he'll extend that lead into the vertical part of the stem and deep ranges of the field, and he'll stack guys up the boundary within the first 10 yards of his routes. If you're stacking guys in the first 10 yards, you've got more than enough explosion to win, and I think with the routes that he does run, there's nothing that would say he's not going to be able to separate in the NFL.
What do you think about Omar Cooper? I really just love Omar Cooper. It's probably, I don't necessarily, it was funny because before the process, he was like an NFL mock draft database and stuff like that had him as like, I mean, you had to scroll down at one point, even during the season, at the sort of toward the beginning of the season, he wasn't even listed in the wide receivers. Like you're talking 500, total prospects, and I couldn't find Omar Cooper. I'm like, what the hell's going on? Finally, he starts showing. Anyway, long story short, it's been a slow rise for him. And I was like, man, this guy's way better than all that. And so I was like, what about Omar Cooper? And now all of a sudden, you see Daniel Jeremiah mocking him to 16th overall to the Jets. Oh my gosh, I feel like that may be a little too hot for Omar Cooper. But I've been sort of small love affair with Omar Cooper, just the way that he plays. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I like him. I can't stand the Debo Samuel comparisons because Debo was 20 pounds heavier, and that's when I look at that, I'm like, listen, Debo's like a running back. Omar Cooper is good after the catch, but he's not. He's 20 pounds is a big difference with a player. If I'm going to compare him to a wide receiver, and also Cooper runs way better routes than Debo did coming out. And I would say it's probably not a big hurdle for him to clear to become a better route runner than Debo within a year or two. Um, the player that I would compare him to is Falcons receiver Roddy White. I would say that's the aspirational comparison. Roddy White was a wrestler. He was a physical player, a very good timing route runner, and he could win after the catch, but you weren't mistaking him for a running back. And he was the timing route specialist for Matt Ryan. He was often while he wasn't the big play guy that Julio was, he was the guy on 3rd and 15 that everybody knew the curl, the comeback, the out was coming, and they'd put two guys on Roddy White, and it didn't matter. Matt Ryan was hitting them. And I think that Omar Cooper has a chance to aspire to become that kind of a player. He's in my top 10.
Yeah. I did comp him to Debo. I will say
Yeah.
Debo was 214 at the combine.
Okay.
So, but he does play at probably 225 anyway. And,
Yeah.
and certainly later Debo, I remember Debo as a prospect because I remember loving Debo. Debo was one of those guys. He got hurt, I think, too, right,
Yeah.
during the process. Didn't quite have the greatest process, but he could do more than just break tackles. And I think when I brought up Debo as the comp for Omar Cooper, it was only insofar as like Debo is a real wide receiver. As you point out, even Omar Cooper is a more advanced wide receiver than
Yeah.
was Debo at the time. And a lot of times we compare the Debo, the players that get compared to Debo are like Malachi Corley, who is only like Debo in that he breaks tackles, but he's not a
Right.
wide receiver.
Right.
Right,
Yeah.
that was the reason that I said Omar Cooper finally a real Debo comparison,
Yeah.
meaning that he actually plays wide receiver too. One of the things I noticed with Omar Cooper is that so Casey Concepcion is sort of the inverse of Omar Cooper in that Casey Concepcion was sort of limited in his first couple of seasons to close to the line of scrimmage bullshit, you know, not
NC
real
State stuff.
routes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the gimmicky stuff, and was sort of on the Malachi Corley path, the career path. And then when he transferred, he's like, I want to run real stuff. Moved almost predominantly outside and showed the world he could do it. Sort of the opposite for Omar Cooper, who had already shown he can do all these things in his previous few seasons. He was deployed more down the field, and then in his final season, was like with Mendoza, they were like, yeah, you're pretty awesome when you get the ball in your hand. Why don't we give it to you more closer to the line of scrimmage and let
Yeah.
you just rip fools? And he has shown the ability to do both. So in a lot of ways, I look at Concepcion and Omar Cooper as similar prospects, insofar as that they both can play inside or out. They both are really good with the ball in their hand. But in terms of technically how good they are, that's a question for you. What are your thoughts when you compare these two players? And they're both getting some first round steam. Are they worthy of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I mean, while I would prefer to see them in more the second round, I think that Cooper, in terms of his, let me look real quick just to see. Yeah, I would say Cooper is a little bit more of a guy that they both have little things with their hands that could be better.
Yeah.
So they're similar in that regard. I think that maybe from the standpoint of, let me look real quick where we're at here. I would say Concepcion's a little better at separating, like his skill with separating against press, which is just a minor thing. And if you're a number 2 receiver compared to a number 1 receiver, but
Right.
it's important. So there's a little more versatility, I think, from a route running standpoint for Concepcion. Whereas with Cooper, there may be a little more versatility in terms of how he's deployed, with the ball, getting the ball into his hands.
Yeah.
But I think that both are guys that I could see late first round, early
Yeah.
second round, and while I would nitpick it, it's not a big deal. And I got love for you, even if I don't love that particular that particular comp. It's only because
No, yeah,
I've
it's fine.
seen too much.
Yeah.
I've seen too much comparisons to Darren Sproles over the years
Yes.
about certain
Yes.
things, and it's that kind of thing. But
It's true though. I'm actually with you. The Debo, it's like every time you're like, God dang, just because a guy breaks tackles doesn't make him Debo.
yeah,
And I think for you, I agree. Like, because even my co-host called me out on it. They're like, dude, Debo's like a lot heavier. And I was like, true. I said, but if you watch Omar Cooper play, he does have the big lower half,
and
right?
I have
But
been guilty of making
yeah,
comparisons. like this, and
Yeah.
not, and I wouldn't even say guilty like I feel guilty I've done it. I've
Right,
been
right.
unrepentant about
Yeah.
making comparisons like you did, because it's in the spirit of what the player is, not one
Yes.
for one
Of
physically
course.
and
Yes.
stylistically.
Yes,
Makes
and there
sense.
probably is a better one, and if I heard, even Luther Burden, was not Debo either, but he sort of, because it's a tired thing. It's basically, who are you going to compare him to? Well, that's the sort of the crown jewel of all that. DJ Moore is another one. Luther Burden's another one. Some of these guys
Yeah.
who can make plays with the ball in their hands and have a little bit of meat. They've got a little something to fend off. Like, that was the thing when I scouted Luther Burden last year, was for whatever reason, based off of a lot of the negative statements about him being gimmicky and things like this, I was thinking that I was going to see a lighter player. He's a dog, man. He's big and can really move guys off of him, which I was surprised to see once he had the ball in his hand. So yeah, you sort of see that from Omar Cooper as well. Obviously, it's
Yeah.
like a screen and they're like, good luck.
Yeah.
One guy ain't taking him down almost ever. It's like you're gonna have to send some help. So yeah, in those ways, I think. But you're right. Debo was 15 is a lot of pounds heavier than these types of players. So they're not quote unquote Debo. But
Right.
you're right. He has more, I think, downfield utility than did Debo as a prospect, I think.
Yep.
Both these guys, I think you're right, though, probably are in a lot of draft classes, probably should be an early second round pick, but they will be probably late first in this
Yes.
particular draft. And for better or worse, we're going to have to figure out if they're any good.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Sleepers. We're going to get you out on this. Brother, we could talk for an embarrassingly long time because there's so much to talk about, but I'm gonna ask the sleeper this way. I'm gonna name the top 12 in the current ADP of dynasty rookie drafts. Okay, Fernando Mendoza, Jeremiah Love, Lemon Tate Tyson, Sadiq and Stowers, Concepcion Cooper, Denzel Boston, Jadarian Price. So of that group, there's only 11 of them, but I did that on purpose because I don't think I'm not bringing Ty Simpson into this because I don't think he belongs, and he's probably the 12th right now as
Right.
far as rookie ADP, but we're just going to leave him off the list. So there's only 11 in the top 12, which I like, fitting for this class. Which player outside that top 12 is most likely to be a star? It's going to be a tough one. And which player inside that top 12 is most likely to be a bust?
Name the players for the bust so I can do that, because
Yep.
I can do outside easily. So name the players again. Who?
Fernando Mendoza,
He's fine.
Jeremiah
He's
Love,
fine.
Makai Lemon,
Fine.
Jordan Tyson, Carnell Tate, Sadiq Stowers, Casey Concepcion, Omar Cooper, Denzel Boston, Jadarian Price.
I'm going to go with either Sadiq or Tyson. Those are the two that I would probably put there. And I think that probably in the top 15, Chris Bell might wind up in that top 15, and
Yeah,
he would be my choice otherwise.
for
He's
star or bust.
for bust. Like,
Okay,
I'm equally afraid to draft him or to not draft him
right,
as far
right,
as where
yeah,
I am with Chris Bell.
yes,
So there's that. Um, other players that you didn't mention in terms of being a star.
mm,
I mean, Damon Claiborne, we talked about. I think that there's some star caliber skills to his game that could be a possibility. Um, you know, Certainly Skylar Bell is certainly on that
yeah,
list as someone who could be that type of sleeper.
yeah.
Now,
That's a good answer.
those are two guys there. Can I just give you one that like is this guy's not on any radar. You probably don't even
Uh,
have to draft him, but I have multiple running backs that I would put in this tier or in this area of like, just wait till the end of the draft, or when you have an expanded preseason roster, if they sign as a UDFA, just hold on to them and see if anything happens. The first one is Miles Montgomery of UCF. He's 5'10", 198. He played at Cincinnati. He didn't get invited to the combine. Um, Fast processor, underrated agility, strong vision, dictates the terms of contact. Like, LaShawn and Jamal Charles often did. So really like him. Um, Robert Henry Jr. of
Yeah.
UTSA, um, kind of could be an Aaron Jones type eventually if
Yeah.
he adds the weight. If not, he could be a poor man's um, or a middle, let's say a middle class James Cook.
Yeah.
Kind of in that range. Jamal Haynes at Georgia Tech, he was a slot receiver for 3 years, didn't catch a single ball. But when you watch this guy run, you go, "Oh, that's a running back." And again, can he gain 10 pounds and be maybe be a little bit more fit. He has some physicality to his game, and he can catch. He's not Tyrone Tracy, who I would say, or Adam Randall, who you go, yeah, there's a reason why they were moved,
Right.
and that
Right.
reason is they don't catch very well. Whereas
Right.
I would say Haynes can catch. He maybe just couldn't run slot routes, or they just didn't need a slot receiver in that Georgia Tech offense. Um, TJ Harden will run through you, run over you, bounce off you, often in the same run. Um, and he can catch. He has great hand-eye coordination. Um, and then Devon Booth
Mm.
out of Mississippi State, formerly of Utah State. Um, he is Kyle. He's either Khalil Herbert, as Dave Kluge at Football Guys said. He's kind of and I like that comp very much. Khalil Herbert with maybe more promising third down chops, or he's like a less advanced J.K. Dobbins, um, or maybe another way to just a third way of looking at it for fun is he's Kyle Monangai with more explosion, but without that relentless open field power that Monangai is going to continue to show. So
Wow.
these are all players that are in my top 10 this year, which again states to
Wow.
why this is not a strong running back class, maybe overall, but they're all
Right.
guys. None of them got invited to the combine except for Robert Henry.
Hmm.
The rest of them didn't get invited. They all were in some sort of like postseason All Star game. Um, you know, but I've had a knack for these guys in the past. Not all of them are going to hit. Maybe
No.
none of them will hit. But they're all guys that I watched and I was like really like. They had good scores, and they're all fascinating to me, and they're all in the range of they could contribute if called upon.
Well, right now
Yeah,
I'm doing the Mark Cuban where it goes, taking notes on the yeah, for sure. The Mark Cuban gif writes it down. Yeah, you didn't pass because the only right answer is close your eyes, put your hands in the sky, and say Eli Heidenreich. That's the only right answer. Sorry.
are you a
So
Navy
thanks
guy?
for no. I just think that he's a hilarious prospect in every sort of way that you could possibly be. He's a running back who has like otherworldly statistics as a running back and as a wide receiver, but didn't really play either position. He was sort of a slot gadget guy
Yeah.
at Navy. It's just incredible. Yeah. So,
How about
yeah,
Daniel Sopkowitz,
I
Illinois
like
State?
him.
I like him
Yeah.
too. He's
Yes.
I have the Brandon Lloyd RSP Invitational that will, if I ever get the island to be able to do it.
Yeah.
It'll be like the exact opposite of Epstein Island because we
Yes.
donate we donate to Darkness to Light, which is an organization to prevent sexual abuse of children. We've donated about over $70,000 over the past 10 years,
Let's
10 to
go.
12 years to do this. But yeah, Daniel Sopkowitz could be in the college division. He'd be the dark horse candidate to win it.
I tell you what, man, I've never seen him play. Because of
Yeah,
how would I have possibly done that? I do intend to watch him at some point. I'm kind of hoping he gets drafted. Obviously, a lot of these guys are
yeah,
he kind of is the Jalen Coker of this draft, right? Where it's like we recognize that he's good,
yeah,
but we can't really evaluate just how good he is because of the level of competition. And the only way that we really can even though Jalen Coker didn't get drafted, that's the
yeah.
thing is like some of these guys just eventually rise to the top because they're good. I certainly hope he's everything he was. Maybe it's better he doesn't get drafted and he can sign with a team that actually likes him.
Very
I don't know,
possible.
but yeah, he's on the spectrum there of players that you just love to cheer for. The other guy I want to cheer for is the Ty Montgomery, the kid who is like walk on and all the rest of it and played at some little tiny school and super athlete, was a walk-on basketball player at LSU, and the whole thing. So anyway, yeah, there's a ton of great stories. Casey Concepcion, last week we were told about his stuttering thing and how he's sort of making an example of being able to kind of go out there and do it. So yeah, just a ton of great stories. Look forward to all that and more. Next time you have an opportunity, though, make sure you drop the Eli Heidenreich as the only superstar left. There's always a player like that every year, but
My
no,
daughter's a Marine. I can't go for a Navy guy. Well,
no,
they
yeah,
do transport them everywhere, so that's okay.
no, yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
no, yeah, you
yeah,
can't do that.
yeah.
That'd be like sacrilege.
It
So,
would be.
hey, thanks for coming on. Thanks for shouting out the charity you're doing there. I think it sounds fantastic. If you could pimp that one more time so that people can hear it and make sure they know where to go to give money to
Sure.
support that, and also anything else you'd like to say before we let you go.
Sure. Well, first, thank you. And it's always a blast getting to talk with you and to have the
Hell yeah.
discourse that we do. That's fantastic. Um, I've been giving to Darkness to Light, D2L.org. If you just want to donate on your own, please do. And they're an organization devoted to preventing sexual abuse of children through training programs. They often have worked after the fact with Michigan State and Penn State and instituted programs, but they do a lot of great preventative work to try and help people understand, whether it's individuals, civic groups, government organizations, private businesses, to help them understand the dynamics of sexual abuse so that they can spot where grooming patterns are happening or potentially are happening. And then if it happens and it's reported, how to handle it so that you don't wind up in the situations that we saw in Happy Valley and in
Yeah.
Lansing. But those are, so it's a great organization from that standpoint. They have a high score on Charity Navigator in terms of how they use their funds. So
Right on.
it's not one of those situations where you're giving money and you're padding some administrator's salary.
Yep.
And, the RSP, if you want to do a combo of both, well, I give up to a certain percentage of my proceeds to at a cap limit now. I used to give 5% or 5% of every sale. I think that's what it was, or 10%. It was 10% of every sale to Darkness Light. I used to do that for the first 10 to 12 years. Lately, I've been kind of keeping it capped. I gotta fund my retirement a little bit, so I've capped it at $5,000 that I've been giving for the past 3 to 4 years as the amount, and we'll be giving $5,000 again this year. I can see based on what
Yep.
we're doing, so we'll be close to about $80,000. It's probably going to be the last year that I'm going to be donating to them. Not because of anything wrong with what's going on, but I've given a lot to them over the years, and I would like to find there's another charitable organization that I would like to give to that's a little bit that's dearer to my heart in another way. And
Nice.
so and I'll announce that probably next year.
That's
But
great.
yeah, so you can find it. You can pay for Matt Waldman's RSP, mattwaldman.com, and for $21.95 you get a pre-draft and post-draft. And if you print it out, I'm sure that you print it out and you steep it from the printer a little bit so that you can stair step it. You can probably say hello to the astronauts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. It's plentiful.
Yes.
It's a plentiful document, and one that you won't be disappointed that you invested in, because it has this and much more. And I thank you so much, Matt. You're one of my favorite people. I love talking to you.
Man, likewise. Thank you.
First couple of times I had you on, I was selfish, and I would have all these conversations with you before the show started and after the show started, because I was like so excited to get to know you. So it's a pleasure to know you. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh man,
and I appreciate it.
Privilege is mine.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And on behalf of everybody here at the Undrafted, on behalf of everybody here at OTC, on behalf of the greatest podcast producer to ever walk the land, Mr. Michael P. Duncan, you have been joined by the sage, Matt Waldman. I am Jax Falcone, and we are out.